Imagine waking up every morning to the sound of church bells, not knowing if today would be the day you'd finally succumb to the plague, starve from another failed harvest, or simply collapse from exhaustion in the fields. Welcome to life in a medieval village, where survival wasn't just difficult, it was a daily miracle. If you've ever romanticized the idea of simple medieval life, away from the complexities of modern civilization, you're about to discover why that fantasy would have been your worst nightmare. Tonight, we're diving deep into the harsh realities of medieval village life, exploring the relentless challenges that made these communities some of the most difficult places to exist in human history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. And dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's journey back to a time when life was brutally short, painfully hard, and surprisingly complex. The year is 1347. You're a peasant living in a small village somewhere in England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. Your entire world consists of perhaps 200 souls, clustered around a manor house, a church, and maybe 30 thatched roof cottages. This is your universe, and escape from it is virtually impossible. Medieval villages weren't quaint countryside retreats. They were survival communities where every day brought new challenges and where the margin between life and death was measured in harvests, weather patterns, and the whims of nature and nobility alike. From dawn to dusk, your life would be governed by the rhythms of agricultural labor, the demands of feudal obligations, and the ever-present specter of disaster. Disease, famine, violence, and back-breaking work weren't occasional hardships. They were the fundamental fabric of daily existence. Over the next hour, we'll explore exactly why medieval villages earned their reputation as some of the most challenging places to live in human history. We'll examine the crushing weight of feudal obligations, the constant threat of starvation, the medieval approach to medicine and hygiene, and the social structures that trapped people in cycles of poverty and dependence. Let's begin with the system that governed everything: feudalism. If you lived in a medieval village, you weren't just poor, you were legally bound to remain poor. The feudal system wasn't simply economic inequality, it was a legal framework that made social mobility virtually impossible. As a peasant, you belonged to the land as much as the land belonged to your lord. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. You were a serf, which meant you couldn't leave the village without permission, couldn't marry without consent, and couldn't even choose your own profession. Your children would inherit your status, creating generational cycles of servitude. Your lord, the local nobleman who owned the land, controlled nearly every aspect of your existence. He decided what crops you could grow, when you could harvest them, and how much of your produce you owed him. Typically, you would work his land for free 3 days a week, tend to your own small plot the remaining days, and still owe him a portion of everything you grew. But the obligations didn't stop there. There were countless fees and taxes that medieval peasants had to pay. The tillage, an arbitrary tax the lord could impose whenever he needed money. The heriot, a death tax where your family had to give the lord your best animal or most valuable possession when you died. The mercia, a fee for permission to marry. The lewite, a fine for unmarried women who became pregnant. Even basic necessities were controlled. If you wanted to grind grain into flour, you had to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. If you wanted to bake bread, you had to use the lord's oven and pay another fee. If you wanted to brew ale, one of the few safe beverages available, you needed permission and had to pay yet another fee. The medieval manor court system reinforced these obligations. Every few weeks, villagers would be summoned to the manor court where the lord or his representative would hear disputes, impose fines, and ensure feudal obligations were met. These courts weren't about justice in any modern sense. They were about maintaining the economic and social order that kept peasants bound to their lords. Justice itself was arbitrary and often brutal. A peasant accused of stealing might face trial by ordeal, being forced to carry a red-hot iron bar, for instance, with guilt or innocence determined by how quickly the burns healed. The logic was that God would protect the innocent, but the reality was that most people suffered permanent injury or death regardless of their actual guilt. The psychological weight of this system was crushing. Imagine knowing that no matter how hard you worked, how clever you were, or how much you achieved, you would never be free. Your children would inherit your chains, and their children would inherit them too. This wasn't temporary hardship, it was permanent social imprisonment. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of medieval Europeans lived under some form of serfdom. In a village of 200 people, perhaps only the priest, the lord's family, and a few skilled craftsmen enjoyed any degree of freedom. Everyone else was trapped in a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal security. The feudal system also created a culture of dependency that made independent thinking dangerous. Peasants who questioned their obligations, who tried to negotiate better terms, or who attempted to leave, were branded as rebels and faced severe punishment. The entire social structure was designed to convince people that their suffering was natural, ordained by God, and unchangeable. If feudalism was the cage that trapped medieval villagers, hunger was the constant companion that tormented them daily. Food scarcity wasn't an occasional crisis, it was the default state of existence for most people living in medieval villages. The average medieval peasant lived in a state of chronic malnutrition. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletons shows clear signs of nutritional deficiency, stunted growth, dental problems, and bone deformities that indicate insufficient protein and vitamin. Most peasants were significantly shorter than modern humans, not just due to genetics, but because they literally didn't have enough food to reach their full growth potential. The medieval diet was monotonous and inadequate. For most villagers, bread made from barley, oats or rye formed the bulk of their caloric intake. Wheat was a luxury crop that peasants grew for their lords but rarely ate themselves. This bread was often dark, coarse, and sometimes contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Vegetables were limited to whatever could be grown in small household gardens: onions, leeks, cabbage, and peas. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were common, but potatoes wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries. Fruits were seasonal and often preserved as dried goods that would last through winter. Meat was extraordinarily rare for peasants. The animals they raised, pigs, chickens, goats, were primarily valuable for their eggs, milk, and eventual sale to pay feudal obligations. A peasant family might eat meat only a few times a year, usually at religious festivals or when an animal died naturally. Even then, the meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it, making it tough and barely digestible. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture meant that hunger followed predictable patterns. Spring was known as the hungry season because the previous year's stored grain was running low, but new crops hadn't yet ripened. Peasants would forage for anything edible: wild greens, roots, bark, and sometimes even clay to fill their stomach. But predictable seasonal hunger was nothing compared to the catastrophic famines that regularly swept through medieval Europe. The Great Famine of 1315–1322 killed millions of people across the continent. Imagine 7 consecutive years of crop failures, where even the wealthy struggled to find food, and peasants resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and in some documented cases, human flesh. These famines weren't rare events. Historical records show major famines occurring roughly every 7 to 10 years throughout the medieval period. Climate change, warfare, disease affecting livestock, and simple bad weather could trigger food crises that lasted for years. The psychological impact of constant hunger was devastating. Medieval chronicles describe people becoming so desperate that they would sell their children into slavery for a handful of grain. Parents would abandon infants they couldn't feed. Communities would turn against each other as social bonds broke down under the stress of starvation. Storage and preservation technology was primitive, making food security nearly impossible. Root cellars, smoking, salting, and drying were the primary methods of food preservation. But these techniques were unreliable. Grain stored in damp conditions would rot or become infested with insects. Preserved meat could spoil without warning. A single bad harvest could doom a village to starvation. The situation was made worse by the fact that peasants had to give a significant portion of their harvest to their lord as rent and taxes. Even in good years, families might have to choose between paying their feudal obligations and feeding their children. Those who couldn't pay faced additional fines, imprisonment, or even death. Medieval medical knowledge offered no solutions for malnutrition. The connection between diet and health was poorly understood. Diseases caused by nutritional deficiencies, scurvy, rickets, pellagra, were common but not recognized as preventable conditions. People suffering from these diseases were often thought to be cursed or morally deficient. The unpredictability of food supply created a culture of anxiety and superstition. Religious ceremonies often focused on praying for good harvests. Folk traditions developed around predicting weather patterns and crop yields. People would hoard any extra food obsessively, knowing that abundance could turn to starvation within a single season. Medieval medical knowledge was a dangerous combination of superstition, religious belief, and occasionally helpful folk remedies, but it was woefully inadequate for dealing with the health challenges of village life. The most obvious problem was basic hygiene. Medieval villages had no understanding of germs or bacterial infection. People rarely bathed, partly because of religious beliefs that cleanliness was vanity, partly because of the practical difficulties of heating water and maintaining privacy. Most peasants owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, which they wore continuously until they literally fell apart. Human waste management was primitive and dangerous. Most villages had no organized sewage system. People simply used outdoor latrines, holes in the ground, or even relieved themselves in streets, fields, or rivers. These waste disposal methods contaminated water supplies and created breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and parasites. Water itself was a constant health hazard. Most villages drew water from wells, springs, or rivers that were often contaminated with human and animal waste. The connection between contaminated water and disease was unknown, so people unknowingly poisoned themselves daily. Waterborne diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were common and often fatal. The medieval approach to disease was largely based on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humours, and treatment involved trying to restore balance through bloodletting, purging, or adjusting diet. These treatments were not only ineffective but often made patients worse. Bloodletting was perhaps the most dangerous common medical practice. Doctors would cut veins or use leeches to remove excess blood, believing this would cure everything from headaches to pneumonia. In reality, bloodletting weakened already sick patients and often led to infection or death from blood loss. Surgical knowledge was extremely limited. There were no anesthetics, no understanding of infection control, and no effective pain management. Surgery was performed with crude tools in unsanitary conditions. Most surgical patients died either from shock during the procedure or from infection afterward. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women in medieval villages. With no understanding of sterile conditions, no trained midwives, and no emergency medical procedures, maternal mortality rates were extraordinarily high. It's estimated that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from related complications. Infant mortality was even higher, with roughly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. Mental illness was completely misunderstood. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions were often thought to be possessed by demons or punished by God for moral failures. Treatment might involve exorcism, physical restraint, or simply abandonment. The stress of medieval life undoubtedly created many mental health problems, but there were no effective treatments available. Dental health was a nightmare. Without sugar, medieval people actually had fewer cavities than modern humans, but they suffered from other dental problems. Bread often contained grit from grinding stones, which wore down teeth, Poor nutrition led to gum disease and tooth loss. Dental abscesses were common and often fatal, as infection could spread to the brain or heart. Skin diseases were endemic. Scabies, caused by tiny mites burrowing under the skin, was so common that it was considered normal. Fungal infections thrived in the damp, dirty conditions where most people lived. Parasites like lice and fleas were universal companions that people simply accepted as part of life. The arrival of epidemic diseases could devastate entire villages. The Black Death of 1347 and 1351 killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, but it was just the most famous of many epidemic diseases that swept through medieval communities. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and tuberculosis regularly killed significant portions of village populations. Medieval people understood that some diseases were contagious, but they had no effective methods of prevention or treatment. During plague outbreaks, villagers might quarantine themselves, but this often trapped healthy people with the infected, making the situation worse. Some communities turned to religious extremism, believing that disease was divine punishment for sin. Folk remedies were sometimes helpful, but often dangerous. Herbal treatments could provide relief for minor ailments, but they could also poison patients. The line between medicine and magic was blurry, with treatments involving elaborate rituals, charms, and superstitious practices that had no medical value. The lack of effective medical care created a culture of fatalism about health. People expected to suffer from painful conditions with no hope of cure. They expected to lose children to disease. They expected to die young. This acceptance of suffering was both a survival mechanism and a source of psychological trauma. Medieval village life was defined by work, relentless, physical, dawn to dusk labor that consumed every waking moment and left people exhausted, injured, and prematurely aged. The romanticized image of peaceful rural life couldn't be further from the reality of medieval agricultural work. The agricultural calendar governed everything. Spring meant plowing frozen, rocky soil with primitive wooden tools pulled by oxen or horses that peasants could barely afford to feed. The plow itself was a simple wooden implement that required enormous physical strength to operate. A peasant might spend 12 hours a day walking behind a plow, fighting to break soil that was often more stone than earth. Planting season required back-breaking labor. Seeds had to be broadcast by hand across plowed fields, then covered with soil using hand. There were no machines to help, no efficient methods of seed distribution. Everything was done by human muscle power, often while fighting weather that could destroy weeks of work in a single storm. The growing season meant constant vigilance. Crops had to be protected from birds, insects, wild animals, and human thieves. Peasants would spend nights in the fields during harvest time, sleeping in crude shelters to guard their crop. Children as young as 6 or 7 would be stationed in fields to scare away birds that could devastate grain crops. Harvest time was a race against weather and time. Grain had to be cut by hand, using sickles, curved blades that required peasants to bend over and cut stalks one at a time. This work was so physically demanding that people often suffered permanent spinal damage. The cut grain then had to be gathered, bundled, and transported to storage areas before rain could ruin it. Threshing grain, separating edible seeds from stalks, was another grueling process. Peasants would beat harvested grain with wooden flails, often working in dusty conditions that damaged their lungs. The grain then had to be winnowed, separated from chaff by tossing it in baskets and letting wind blow away the lighter debris. But agricultural work was only part of the labor burden. Medieval peasants were also responsible for maintaining buildings, making tools, producing textiles, and countless other tasks necessary for survival. Houses needed constant repair because they were built with temporary materials, mud, straw, and wood, that rotted quickly in wet conditions. Women's work was particularly demanding. In addition to helping with agricultural tasks, women were responsible for food preparation, textile production, childcare, and household management. They would spin wool or flax into thread, weave cloth, sew clothes, preserve food, brew ale, tend gardens, care for livestock, and manage households with no modern conveniences. Textile production was especially labor-intensive. Creating a single garment required weeks of work. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, woven into cloth, and then sewn into clothing. The entire process was done by hand with primitive tools. A peasant family might own only 2 or 3 complete sets of clothing, which they would wear until they literally fell apart. Children were expected to work from an early age. By age 7, children were performing significant agricultural tasks. They would tend livestock, help with harvest, spin thread, and perform countless other jobs. There was no concept of childhood as a time for play or education. Children were small adults who contributed to family survival from the moment they were physically capable. The work was not only physically demanding, but also dangerous. Agricultural accidents were common and often fatal. People were injured by farm animals, cut by tools, crushed by falling trees, or hurt in countless other ways. Without modern medical care, even minor injuries could become life-threatening infections. Work-related injuries accumulated over time. By middle age, most peasants suffered from arthritis, back problems, repetitive stress injuries, and other conditions caused by decades of hard physical labor. The average medieval peasant was probably in constant pain from work-related injuries and chronic conditions. The feudal system made this labor even more oppressive. Peasants didn't just work for their own survival, they were legally obligated to work for their lord's benefit. The most productive days of each week were spent working land that belonged to someone else, growing crops they would never eat, maintaining buildings they would never live in. Seasonal variations in work created periods of intense labor, alternating with periods of relative inactivity. During harvest time, peasants might work 18 hours a day for weeks. During winter, there was less agricultural work, but more time spent on crafts, home maintenance, and preparation for the next growing season. The psychological impact of this endless labor was people had no time for rest, recreation, or personal development. Life was a constant struggle against physical exhaustion, with no hope of escape or improvement. The work was not meaningful in any modern sense. It was simply survival, repeated day after day until death. Beyond the physical hardships of medieval village life lay a social structure that was equally oppressive. Medieval villages weren't just places where people lived. They were carefully controlled communities where every aspect of social behavior was monitored, regulated, and punished when necessary. The medieval village was essentially a surveillance state. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and privacy was virtually non-existent. People lived in one-room cottages where entire families shared sleeping, cooking, and living spaces. Personal conflicts, family disputes, and individual struggles were public knowledge. There was no escape from social scrutiny. Social hierarchy was rigid and unchanging. At the top stood the lord and his family, followed by the priest, then perhaps a few skilled craftsmen, and finally the vast majority of peasants. This hierarchy wasn't just economic, it was believed to be divinely ordained. People were taught that questioning social order was equivalent to questioning God's will. The church played a central role in maintaining social control. The village priest was often the only literate person in the community, and he used this position to reinforce messages about obedience, suffering, and accepting one's place in the social order. Religious sermons emphasized that earthly suffering was temporary and that peasants who accepted their fate would be rewarded in the afterlife. Marriage and family life were heavily regulated. Peasants couldn't marry without their lord's permission, and they had to pay fees for the privilege. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement designed to combine resources and labor. Romantic love was a luxury that few could afford to consider. Women had virtually no rights in marriage and were legally considered property of their fathers, then their husbands. Gender roles were strictly enforced. Women were expected to be subservient to men in all aspects of life. They couldn't own property, make legal decisions, or even speak in public without permission. Women who violated these expectations faced social ostracism, physical punishment, or even accusations of witchcraft. The concept of individual rights didn't exist. People were defined by their relationships to others, as someone's serf, someone's wife, someone's child. Personal autonomy was not just discouraged, but literally illegal. Making independent decisions about where to live, what work to do, or whom to marry was considered rebellion against the natural order. Social mobility was virtually impossible. A peasant born into serfdom would die a serf. Their children would be serfs. Their grandchildren would be serfs. The social position you were born into determined everything about your life, your work, your marriage prospects, your legal rights, and your social relationships. Village justice was arbitrary and often brutal. Minor infractions could result in public humiliation, physical punishment, or heavy fines. The stocks and pillory were common punishments, where offenders were locked in wooden devices and exposed to public ridicule and physical abuse. More serious crimes might result in mutilation or death. Gossip and social reputation were powerful tools of control. In a community where everyone knew everyone else, rumors could destroy lives. People who violated social norms might find themselves ostracized, unable to find work, or even driven from the village entirely. The fear of social rejection kept people in line as effectively as any legal punishment. Education was non-existent for most villagers. Literacy was limited to clergy and nobility. The vast majority of peasants couldn't read or write, which kept them dependent on others for information about laws, rights, and opportunities. This illiteracy was intentional. Educated peasants might question their treatment or seek to improve their condition. Entertainment and recreation were limited and often regulated. Religious festivals provided some relief from daily hardship, but even these were used to reinforce social hierarchy. The lord might provide food and drink for special occasions, but this generosity was a calculated reminder of peasants' dependence on noble charity. Superstition and fear were used to maintain control. People were taught to fear supernatural punishment for disobedience, to believe that challenging authority would bring divine retribution. Accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or other spiritual crimes could be used to eliminate troublemakers or social critics. The village economy was deliberately kept primitive. Lords had no incentive to improve agricultural techniques or introduce labor-saving innovations that might reduce their control over peasant labor. Technological progress was actually discouraged because it might disrupt the social order that kept peasants dependent. Mental health support was non-existent. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems had no resources for help. The constant stress of poverty, overwork, and social oppression undoubtedly created many mental health issues, but these were either ignored or attributed to moral failings. Medieval villages existed in a world where violence was not an aberration, but a fundamental part of daily life. The romantic notion of peaceful rural communities is shattered by the reality of constant warfare, banditry, and casual brutality that defined medieval existence. Warfare was endemic in medieval Europe. Lords fought constantly over territory, inheritance rights, and political power. These conflicts weren't distant events that peasants could ignore. They were local disasters that directly impacted village life. When armies moved through the countryside, they lived off the land, which meant stealing crops, livestock, and anything else of value from peasant communities. The medieval military doctrine of living off the land was essentially legalized theft. Soldiers would descend on villages like locusts, taking food, animals, tools, and other resources. They would often destroy what they couldn't take, burning crops and buildings to prevent enemies from using them. Villages could be completely destroyed by the passage of friendly armies. Mercenary companies were particularly dangerous. These groups of professional soldiers would hire themselves out to various lords, but between contracts they often turned to banditry. They would establish camps in rural areas and systematically rob and terrorize local villages. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of mercenary companies that devastated entire regions. Local warfare was constant. Neighboring lords would raid each other's territories, and peasants caught in the middle faced robbery, assault, and a village might be attacked multiple times in a single year by different groups of armed men. There was no police force, no standing army to provide protection, and no legal recourse for victims. The threat of violence shaped every aspect of village life. Peasants would hide food and valuables, constantly watching for signs of approaching armed men. They would construct hiding places in forests or underground chambers where they could shelter during attack. Some villages built crude fortifications, but these were rarely effective against determined attackers. Sexual violence was a common weapon of war. Soldiers would routinely rape women as a form of terrorizing conquered populations. Medieval legal systems offered no protection for victims of sexual assault, and the social stigma attached to rape often ruined women's lives, even if they survived the attack. Personal violence was also endemic within villages. Medieval people resolved disputes through physical confrontation far more readily than modern populations. Arguments over property, work obligations, or personal slights regularly escalated to violence. The lack of effective law enforcement meant that people had to defend themselves or accept victimization. Honor culture dominated medieval social relationships. Men were expected to respond to insults or challenges with violence, and those who failed to do so were considered cowards. This cultural emphasis on violent resolution of conflicts meant that minor disputes could escalate into deadly feuds that lasted for generations. Medieval justice was often indistinguishable from revenge. The legal system was based on the principle that victims or their families were responsible for pursuing justice. This meant that crimes were often punished through cycles of retaliation, rather than through impartial legal proceedings. Blood feuds could consume entire communities for decades. Banditry was a constant threat. Highways were dangerous, and even short journeys between villages could be deadly. Bandits would target travelers, merchants, and anyone who appeared to have valuable. The poverty of most peasants offered some protection, but even poor people could be robbed of the few possessions they had. The death penalty was used extensively for crimes that modern societies would consider minor. Theft of property worth more than a few pennies could result in execution. Poaching, hunting on noble land, was often punishable by death. Even minor infractions like insulting a lord could result in execution or severe physical punishment. Public executions were common entertainment. Villagers would gather to watch hangings, beheadings, and other forms of capital punishment. These events were designed to terrorize the population and demonstrate the consequences of challenging authority. The casual brutality of these spectacles reveals how normalized violence was in medieval society. Torture was an accepted part of the judicial system. Accused criminals were routinely tortured to extract confessions, and the methods used were deliberately designed to cause maximum pain and suffering. Iron boots, thumb screws, and other devices were used to break bones and crush body parts. Many innocent people confessed to crimes they didn't commit simply to end their torment. Child abuse was endemic and largely ignored. Children were considered property of their parents, and there were no legal protections against physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Medieval records suggest that child abandonment, infanticide, and abuse were common, often justified by economic necessity or social customs. The constant threat of violence created a culture of fear and suspicion. People learned to trust no one, to assume that strangers were dangerous, and to be prepared for attack at any moment. This hypervigilance was a survival mechanism, but it also created psychological trauma that affected entire communities. The physical environment of medieval villages was a health hazard that modern people would find almost impossible to endure. The combination of poor sanitation, environmental pollution, and primitive living conditions created a toxic environment that shortened lives and caused constant suffering. Medieval villages were incredibly dirty by modern standards. Streets were unpaved and became muddy quagmires during rain. Since there were no sewage systems, human and animal waste accumulated in streets, yards, and waterways. The smell alone would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. But medieval people had no choice but to live with the constant stench of decomposing organic matter. Water pollution was universal. Villages dumped waste directly into rivers and streams, which were also used as sources of drinking water. Animal waste from livestock, human sewage, and industrial waste from activities like tanning leather all contaminated water supply. The result was that every drink of water was potentially deadly. Air pollution was also a serious problem. Most homes were heated with wood or peat fires that produced thick, choking smoke. Since medieval houses had poor ventilation, people constantly breathed smoke-filled air. The soot and ash from these fires covered everything and created respiratory problems that modern people would find unbearable. Indoor air quality was particularly bad. Medieval homes were small, poorly ventilated structures where people, animals, and fires shared the same space. The combination of smoke, body odor, animal smells, and cooking odors created an atmosphere that was literally toxic. People suffered from constant respiratory infections, eye problems, and other health issues caused by poor air quality. Pest infestations were universal. Rats, mice, insects, and other vermin lived alongside human inhabitants. These pests carried diseases, contaminated food supplies, and made life miserable. The lack of effective pest control meant that people simply accepted sharing their homes with dangerous animals. Food storage was primitive and dangerous. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products spoiled quickly. Grain storage was vulnerable to rodent infestation and moisture damage. People regularly ate spoiled food because they had no alternatives, leading to food poisoning and other digestive problems. Building materials were inadequate and dangerous. Most peasant homes were built with mud, straw, and wood that provided little protection from weather. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, and floors were often just packed earth. These buildings were fire hazards that could be completely destroyed by a single spark. Heating systems were primitive and dangerous. Open fires provided warmth, but also created constant fire hazard. Many villages experienced devastating fires that destroyed entire neighborhoods. The combination of thatched roofs, wooden construction, and open flames made fire a constant threat. Clothing and textiles were rarely cleaned. People wore the same clothes for weeks or months without washing them. Wool and linen garments absorbed body odor, sweat, and dirt, creating breeding grounds for parasites and bacteria. The lack of soap and hot water made effective cleaning nearly impossible. Personal hygiene was minimal. People rarely bathed, partly because of practical difficulties, and partly because of religious beliefs that associated cleanliness with vanity. Hair was rarely washed, teeth were never cleaned, and body odor was simply accepted as natural. This poor hygiene contributed to the spread of disease and parasites. Waste disposal was haphazard and dangerous. Human waste was often just thrown out windows or doors. Animal waste accumulated in streets and yards. Garbage was typically just dumped in convenient locations where it attracted vermin and created breeding grounds for disease. The combination of poor sanitation and crowded living conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through villages because people lived in close proximity with no understanding of how to prevent contagion. A single case of plague, smallpox, or other infectious disease could quickly kill significant portions of a village population. Seasonal environmental challenges made life even more difficult. Winter meant living in smoke-filled, poorly heated homes where people huddled together for warmth. Spring brought floods that contaminated water supplies and destroyed homes. Summer heat made the smell of accumulated waste unbearable. Autumn brought the challenge of preparing for winter while fighting to preserve food supplies. The lack of understanding about environmental health meant that people couldn't take effective action to improve their condition. They didn't understand that contaminated water caused disease, that smoke damaged lungs, or that poor sanitation attracted disease-carrying pests. This ignorance perpetuated environmental problems that could have been solved with basic knowledge. The cumulative effect of all these hardships created a psychological environment that was as brutal as the physical conditions. Medieval villagers lived with levels of stress, trauma, and despair that would be considered pathological by modern standards. Chronic stress was a constant companion. The combination of food insecurity, threat of violence, oppressive social control, and endless physical labor created a state of perpetual anxiety. People lived in constant fear of starvation, disease, attack, or punishment. This chronic stress had profound effects on mental and physical health. The physiological impact of this constant stress cannot be overstated. Medieval villagers existed in a perpetual state of fight or flight response, their bodies flooded with stress hormones that modern medicine knows cause devastating long-term damage. Their immune systems were constantly compromised, making them more susceptible to the diseases that regularly swept through villages. The stress hormone cortisol, released continuously in response to threats, broke down their bodies from within, accelerating aging and contributing to the remarkably short lifespans of medieval peasants. Sleep deprivation compounded these stress responses. Villagers would lie awake at night, their minds racing with worries about the next day's survival. Would there be enough food for the children? Would the Lord's tax collectors arrive demanding more grain than the family could spare? Would disease strike the livestock, destroying the family's only source of protein and labor? These anxieties created a vicious cycle where exhaustion made daily challenges even more overwhelming, which in turn generated more anxiety. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that medieval people had no way to understand or treat. Chronic headaches, digestive problems, muscle tension, and heart palpitations were dismissed as divine punishment or moral failings. People developed nervous tics, speech impediments, and other stress-related disorders that made them targets for suspicion and persecution. A person who stuttered or had uncontrollable tremors might be suspected of demonic possession, adding social persecution to their existing psychological burdens. Trauma was normalized. Children witnessed violence, death, and suffering from an early age. They saw family members die from disease, watched public executions, and experienced physical abuse as routine discipline. Adults suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but medieval society had no concept of mental health or trauma treatment. The normalization of trauma created a society where extreme psychological damage was considered ordinary. Veterans of the countless small wars and raids that plagued medieval Europe returned to their villages carrying what modern psychology would recognize as severe PTSD. These men had seen friends disemboweled, had killed other human beings in close combat, had witnessed the rape and murder of civilians, yet they were expected to seamlessly reintegrate into village life as if nothing had happened. These traumatized individuals often became sources of additional trauma for their families and communities. Unable to process their experiences or find healthy outlets for their psychological pain, they frequently turned to violence, alcohol abuse, or other destructive behaviors. A father who had witnessed battlefield horrors might beat his children with extraordinary brutality, unconsciously reenacting the violence he had experienced. A mother who had survived a raid might develop such severe anxiety that she became unable to function, leaving her children to fend for themselves. The lack of understanding about trauma meant that victims were often blamed for their suffering. A person who couldn't stop reliving a traumatic event might be accused of dwelling on past sins or failing to trust in divine providence. Those who developed what we now recognize as dissociative disorders might be suspected of witchcraft or demonic possession. The social stigma attached to psychological distress forced people to hide their symptoms, preventing them from seeking even the limited support that might have been available through religious confession or community ritual. Children who witnessed traumatic events had no framework for understanding what they had seen. A child who watched a parent die slowly from disease, or who saw a sibling killed in an accident, was expected to simply accept these experiences as part of life. The absence of child psychology or trauma counseling meant that these experiences became embedded in their developing minds, shaping their worldview and emotional responses for the rest of their lives. Depression was widespread, but unrecognized. The hopelessness of medieval village life, the knowledge that conditions would never improve, that children would inherit the same suffering, that death was the only escape, created widespread People who showed signs of depression were often thought to be lazy, sinful, or possessed by demons. The medieval understanding of depression was filtered through religious and moral frameworks that blamed the sufferer for their condition. A person who couldn't summon the energy to work, who withdrew from social interactions, or who expressed hopelessness about the future, was seen as committing the sin of despair, a rejection of divine providence, and a failure of faith. This moral interpretation of depression meant that sufferers faced punishment rather than treatment, deepening their psychological distress. The symptoms of depression were often misinterpreted as spiritual problems requiring religious intervention. A person who couldn't eat due to depression might be forced to fast as penance for their sins. Someone who couldn't sleep might be kept awake for religious vigil. Those who expressed thoughts of death might be subjected to exorcism or other traumatic religious rituals designed to drive out supposed demons. The lack of effective treatment for depression meant that the condition often progressed to complete psychological breakdown. People would simply stop functioning, becoming catatonic, or developing what modern psychology would recognize as severe mental illness. Medieval communities had no resources for caring for such individuals, who were often abandoned to die or killed as a mercy. Seasonal depression was particularly devastating in medieval villages. The long, dark winters, combined with food shortages and increased confinement, created periods of intense psychological distress. People would spend months in cramped, dark spaces with little food and no hope of improvement until spring. Many didn't survive these psychological assaults, either dying from the physical effects of depression or taking their own lives. The absence of hope was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval depression. Modern people facing difficult circumstances can usually imagine that things might improve, that their children might have better opportunities, or that their suffering serves some greater purpose. Medieval peasants had no such comfort. They knew with certainty that their children would face the same hardships, that their social position would never improve, and that their only escape from suffering was death. Anxiety disorders were common. The constant threats to survival created hypervigilance and chronic worry. People developed obsessive behaviors around food storage, security, and social relationships. The fear of making mistakes that could lead to punishment or death created paralyzing anxiety for many villagers. The hypervigilance required for survival in medieval villages created a state of constant alertness that was psychologically exhausting. People had to monitor their environment continuously for signs of danger. The approach of armed men, changes in weather that might affect crops, signs of disease in animals or humans, or social cues that might indicate displeasure from authority. This constant state of alertness prevented the psychological rest that humans need for mental health. Obsessive-compulsive behaviors developed as coping mechanisms for the overwhelming uncertainty of medieval life. People might count and recount their grain stores obsessively, check and recheck the security of their homes, or engage in repetitive rituals designed to ward off disaster. These behaviors provided a temporary sense of control in an environment where they actually had very little control over their fate. The fear of making social mistakes created a form of social anxiety that was particularly debilitating. In a society where a wrong word or inappropriate behavior could lead to punishment, exile, or death, people developed intense anxiety about social interactions. They might rehearse conversations obsessively, avoid speaking in public, or become paralyzed by indecision when faced with social choice. Panic attacks were common, but misunderstood. People experiencing the physical symptoms of panic, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, sweating, trembling, might believe they were dying or being attacked by supernatural force. The lack of medical understanding meant that these episodes were often interpreted as demonic possession or divine punishment, adding shame and religious persecution to the original psychological distress. The anxiety extended to every aspect of daily life. People worried constantly about their livestock, their crops, their children's health, their standing in the community, and their relationship with divine authority. This constant worry created a mental state where relaxation was impossible and joy was rare. The few moments of peace that might have provided psychological respite were overshadowed by anxiety about when the next crisis would strike. Grief was a constant presence, with infant mortality rates around 50% and life expectancy in the 30s. People were constantly losing loved ones. Medieval society had rituals for dealing with death, but the sheer volume of loss was overwhelming. People learned to expect death and to suppress emotional responses to it. The frequency of death in medieval villages created a form of anticipatory grief that was psychologically devastating. Parents would look at their children and wonder which ones would survive to adulthood. Spouses would prepare emotionally for their partner's death, knowing that most marriages ended in early widowhood. Children would watch their parents age rapidly under the stress of hard labor and poor nutrition, preparing for orphanhood while still young themselves. The emotional suppression required to function in this environment of constant loss created a kind of psychological numbness. People learned to detach emotionally from their loved ones as a protective mechanism, but this detachment prevented the formation of deep, meaningful relationships. The inability to form secure attachments had profound effects on psychological development and social functioning. The grief process was complicated by the practical demands of survival. When a family member died, the survivors couldn't take time to properly mourn because they had to immediately focus on replacing the deceased person's labor and economic contribution. A widow might be forced to remarry within days of her husband's death, not because she had processed her grief, but because she couldn't survive economically without a male partner. Children who lost parents faced particular psychological challenges. Orphaned children were often seen as burdens by their extended families or communities, leading to rejection and abandonment at the time when they most needed support. The psychological trauma of losing parents was compounded by the trauma of social rejection and economic desperation. The cumulative effect of multiple losses created a form of complicated grief that modern psychology recognizes as a serious mental health condition. People who had lost multiple children, spouses, parents, and siblings often developed a profound sense of meaninglessness and despair. They might become unable to form new attachments, expecting that everyone they cared about would eventually die and leave them alone. Social isolation was endemic despite crowded living conditions. The lack of privacy meant that people couldn't form genuine intimate relationships. Everyone was constantly performing for social approval, hiding their true thoughts and feelings. This created a sense of loneliness even in the midst of community. The paradox of social isolation in overcrowded conditions was one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of medieval village life. People lived in close physical proximity but were emotionally distant from each other. Constant surveillance by neighbors, religious authorities, and social superiors meant that authentic self-expression was dangerous. People learned to maintain facades that protected them from social punishment, but prevented genuine human connection. The lack of private space meant that people couldn't process their emotions or thoughts without being observed. There was no place to cry, to express anger, to work through psychological problems, or to simply be alone with one's thoughts. This constant performance of social acceptability was emotionally exhausting and prevented the psychological processing that humans need for mental health. Trust was nearly impossible to develop in an environment where survival often depended on betraying others. People might inform on their neighbors to authorities, compete for limited resources, or abandon community members who became burdens. The knowledge that anyone might betray them for personal advantage made deep friendships and intimate relationships extremely difficult to maintain. The social hierarchy also created barriers to genuine connection. People couldn't express their true feelings about their conditions, their treatment by authorities, or their fears and hopes for the future. Any expression of dissatisfaction with the social order was dangerous, forcing people to maintain a facade of contentment and acceptance that prevented honest communication. Even within families, genuine intimacy was difficult to achieve. Parents couldn't express their fears about their children's futures. Spouses couldn't discuss their desperation about their circumstances, and children couldn't voice their confusion and terror about the adult world they were forced to navigate. The emotional distance required for psychological protection prevented the formation of supportive family relationships. Learned helplessness was a survival mechanism. People who repeatedly attempted to improve their conditions and failed eventually stopped trying. This passive acceptance of suffering was often mistaken for virtue or piety, but it was actually a psychological defense against the pain of constant disappointment. The development of learned helplessness was almost inevitable in medieval village life. The social and economic system was designed to prevent upward mobility, and most attempts to improve one's condition were met with punishment rather than success. A peasant who tried to learn to read might be beaten for getting above their station. A family that attempted to save money might have their savings confiscated by authorities. Those who tried to move to different villages might be returned to their original lords as runaway serfs. After repeated failures and punishments, people learned that effort was pointless and potentially dangerous. They stopped trying to improve their conditions and instead focused on avoiding punishment and maintaining their current level of suffering. This psychological adaptation helped them survive in an impossible system, but it also prevented them from taking advantage of the few opportunities that might have existed for improvement. The learned helplessness extended to every aspect of life. People stopped trying to improve their living conditions, their relationships, their health, or their children's prospects. They accepted disease, abuse, poverty, and social oppression as inevitable parts of life that couldn't be changed. This psychological state was often praised by religious authorities as proper submission to divine will, but it was actually a form of psychological damage caused by systematic oppression. The few individuals who maintained hope and continued trying to improve their conditions were often seen as troublemakers or threats to social stability. Their persistence in the face of repeated failure was interpreted as pride, rebellion, or lack of faith, rather than as healthy psychological functioning. This social pressure to accept learned helplessness reinforced the psychological damage and made recovery even more difficult. The learned helplessness also affected cognitive functioning. People who had given up trying to solve problems stopped developing problem-solving skills. They became passive recipients of whatever happened to them rather than active agents in their own life. This cognitive shutdown was a protective mechanism, but it also prevented them from recognizing and taking advantage of opportunities that might have improved their situation. Substance abuse was common. Alcohol was one of the few available methods of escaping psychological pain. People would drink to excess when possible, using alcohol to numb the emotional pain of their existence. This created additional problems, as alcohol abuse led to violence, poor decision-making, and health problems. Alcohol was not just a recreational substance in medieval villages. It was often safer to drink than water, which was frequently contaminated with deadly pathogens. However, the psychological relief that alcohol provided made it an attractive escape from the constant stress and trauma of daily life. People would drink themselves into unconsciousness when they had the opportunity, seeking temporary relief from their psychological pain. The alcohol available to medieval peasants was often of poor quality and high potency. Home-brewed ales and wines were frequently contaminated with harmful substances, and the distillation process was primitive and dangerous. People might consume alcohol that contained toxic levels of methanol or other harmful compounds, leading to blindness, brain damage, or death. Binge drinking was common during festivals, harvest times, and other occasions when alcohol was available. People would consume massive quantities of alcohol in short periods, leading to alcohol poisoning, accidents, and violent behavior. The temporary escape from psychological pain was so valuable that people were willing to risk their lives for it. The social problems caused by alcohol abuse compounded the existing psychological distress. Drunk men might beat their wives and children more severely than usual, make poor decisions that endangered their family's survival, or engage in fights that led to injury or death. Drunk women might neglect their children, fail to perform essential household tasks, or become victims of sexual assault. The guilt and shame associated with alcohol abuse added another layer of psychological distress. People knew that their drinking was causing problems for their families and communities, but they felt powerless to stop. The lack of understanding about addiction meant that alcohol abuse was seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, preventing people from seeking help. Other forms of substance abuse were also common. People might consume various plants, mushrooms, or other substances that provided temporary relief from psychological pain. Some of these substances were toxic and caused additional health problems, while others were relatively harmless, but still represented an escape from unbearable reality. Religious extremism often developed as a coping mechanism. Some people turned to fanatical religious beliefs, hoping that extreme devotion would earn them divine intervention, or at least spiritual comfort. This could lead to self-harm, obsessive religious practices, and social conflict with those who didn't share their extremist views. The development of religious extremism was often a response to psychological trauma and people who had lost multiple family members, who had been victims of violence, or who had witnessed terrible suffering, might turn to extreme religious practices as a way of making sense of their experience. They might believe that their suffering was a test of faith, or that extreme devotion would guarantee them a better afterlife. Self-flagellation and other forms of religious self-harm were common among those who had developed extremist belief. People would beat themselves with whips, wear painful hair shirts, or engage in other forms of self-torture as expressions of religious devotion. These practices were often encouraged by religious authorities who saw them as signs of spiritual advancement, but they were actually expressions of psychological distress and trauma. Obsessive religious practices could consume people's. They might spend hours in prayer, engage in repetitive religious rituals, or become fixated on religious texts or symbols. These behaviors provided a sense of control and meaning in an otherwise chaotic and meaningless existence, but they also prevented people from addressing their practical needs and psychological problems. Religious extremism often led to social conflict within communities. People with extremist beliefs might condemn their neighbors for insufficient piety, report them to religious authorities for minor infractions, or engage in vigilante justice against those they perceived as sinful. This religious persecution added another layer of social stress to already fragile communities. The extremist religious practices sometimes led to mass hysteria and social movements that were psychologically and socially destructive. People might become convinced that the end of the world was imminent, that they were personally chosen by God for special missions, or that they had received divine visions commanding them to take specific action. These beliefs could lead to abandonment of families, destruction of property, or violent conflict with authorities. The lack of hope was perhaps the most devastating psychological burden. Modern people facing hardship can usually imagine that conditions might improve, that their children might have better lives, or that their suffering serves some greater purpose. Medieval peasants had no such hope. They knew their conditions would never improve, that their children would suffer as they had suffered, and that their only escape was death. The absence of hope was not just a personal psychological problem, it was a systemic feature of medieval society. The feudal system was designed to prevent social mobility and to maintain strict class divisions. Religious doctrine taught that earthly suffering was inevitable, and attempting to improve one's condition was potentially sinful. The economic system provided no opportunities for advancement, and the political system offered no mechanisms for change. This systematic elimination of hope had profound effects on psychological development and social functioning. People who had no hope for the future stopped making long-term plans, stopped investing in relationships, and stopped caring about their own well-being. They became focused only on immediate survival, unable to engage in the kind of forward thinking that might have improved their situation. The hopelessness was particularly devastating for parents, who could offer their children nothing but the promise of continued suffering. Parents might look at their newborn children and feel despair rather than joy, knowing that they were bringing new souls into a world of pain and degradation. This emotional response to childbirth contributed to the high rates of infant abandonment and infanticide. The lack of hope also affected cognitive development. People who saw no possibility for improvement stopped learning new skills, stopped trying to understand their environment, and stopped engaging in creative or intellectual activity. The mental stimulation that humans need for psychological health was absent from their lives, leading to cognitive stagnation and intellectual poverty. The hopelessness extended to spiritual matters as well. While religious doctrine promised rewards in the afterlife, the harsh realities of medieval religious practice often made even this hope seem distant and uncertain. People might worry that they were too sinful to earn salvation, that they lacked the spiritual discipline required for divine favor, or that the promises of religion were simply false comfort designed to keep them passive. Sleep disturbances were universal. The combination of physical discomfort, chronic pain, anxiety, and overcrowded living conditions meant that most people suffered from poor sleep quality. They would lie awake worrying about the next day's challenges, listening for sounds that might indicate danger, or simply unable to find comfortable positions on hard surfaces. The sleep environment in medieval villages was hostile to rest and recovery. People slept on straw mattresses that were infested with insects, in rooms that were either too cold or too hot, with multiple family members sharing the same sleeping space. Privacy was impossible, and the sounds and movements of others constantly disrupted sleep. The smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and cooking fires created an atmosphere that was hardly conducive to rest. The physical discomfort of medieval sleeping conditions was compounded by chronic pain from injuries, malnutrition, and hard labor. People might lie awake for hours trying to find a position that didn't aggravate their aching backs, swollen joints, or infected wounds. The lack of effective pain medication meant that physical discomfort was a constant barrier to sleep. The psychological factors that interfered with sleep were equally challenging. People would lie awake worrying about their immediate survival needs, whether there would be enough food for the next day, whether their livestock was secure, whether they had inadvertently offended someone in authority. These worries created a state of mental arousal that was incompatible with sleep. The fear of nighttime dangers also interfered with sleep. People had to remain alert for sounds that might indicate approaching raiders, wild animals, or other threats. The knowledge that their homes offered little protection from determined attackers meant that true relaxation was impossible. Many people developed the habit of sleeping lightly, waking frequently to check their surroundings for signs of danger. The poor sleep quality had cascading effects on physical and mental health. Sleep deprivation compromised immune function, making people more susceptible to the diseases that regularly swept through medieval villages. It also impaired cognitive function, making it difficult to make good decisions, solve problems, or perform skilled tasks. The combination of physical exhaustion and mental impairment created a vicious cycle where poor sleep made daily challenges more difficult, which in turn created more stress and anxiety that interfered with sleep. The lack of understanding about sleep hygiene meant that people had no strategies for improving their sleep quality. They didn't understand the importance of regular sleep schedules, the effects of alcohol and food on sleep, or the relationship between physical activity and sleep quality. The few remedies that were available, herbal teas, prayers, or ritual practices, were often ineffective or even counterproductive. Cognitive function was impaired by malnutrition and stress. Chronic hunger affects brain function, making it difficult to think clearly, make decisions, or solve problems. The constant stress of survival mode prevented people from developing higher cognitive skills or engaging in abstract thinking. The effects of malnutrition on cognitive development were particularly severe for children, whose brains were still developing. Children who suffered from protein deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, or chronic hunger often experienced permanent cognitive impairment that affected their ability to learn, reason, and adapt to new situations. The intellectual potential of entire generations was lost to malnutrition. The chronic stress of medieval life also had direct effects on brain function. The constant release of stress hormones interfered with memory formation, attention, and executive function. People found it difficult to concentrate on complex tasks, to remember important information, or to plan for the future. The mental resources that might have been used for learning, creativity, or problem-solving were consumed by the immediate demands of survival. The lack of intellectual stimulation in medieval villages contributed to cognitive stagnation. People had no access to books, formal education, or intellectual discourse. They were isolated from the broader world of ideas and knowledge that might have stimulated their mind. The few opportunities for intellectual growth, religious instruction, oral traditions, or practical skills training were limited and often focused on maintaining existing social structures rather than encouraging independent thinking. The combination of malnutrition, stress, and intellectual isolation created a population that was cognitively impaired by modern standards. People might have been capable of complex reasoning and creative problem-solving under different circumstances, but the conditions of medieval life prevented the development of these capacities. The loss of human intellectual potential was one of the most tragic aspects of medieval village life. The cognitive impairment also affected social and emotional development. People who couldn't think clearly had difficulty understanding complex social situations, managing interpersonal relationships, or regulating their emotions. This contributed to the social dysfunction and psychological distress that characterized medieval communities. Emotional regulation was primitive. People had no understanding of mental health or emotional wellness. They dealt with psychological pain through violence, religious ritual, or simple endurance. The lack of effective coping mechanisms meant that emotional problems often escalated into destructive behavior. The absence of psychological knowledge in medieval society meant that people had no framework for understanding or managing their emotions. They didn't understand the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, or the ways in which emotional states could be influenced by physical health, social conditions, or psychological practices. Without this understanding, they were unable to develop effective strategies for emotional regulation. The few coping mechanisms that were available were often destructive or ineffective. Violence was commonly used as a way of releasing emotional tension, but it created additional problems and trauma. Physical aggression might provide temporary relief from psychological pain, but it damaged relationships, escalated conflicts, and often led to serious injury or death. Religious rituals were sometimes used as emotional coping mechanisms, but they were often focused on suppressing emotions rather than processing them healthily. People might be encouraged to pray away their sadness, to accept their anger as sinful, or to view their fear as a lack of faith. These approaches prevented the healthy expression and processing of emotions that humans need for psychological well-being. The strategy of simple endurance, just waiting for painful emotions to pass, was often the only option available to medieval people. While this approach might have helped them survive immediate emotional crises, it prevented the development of more sophisticated emotional skills. People who relied solely on endurance often became emotionally numb or developed chronic psychological problems. The lack of emotional regulation skills affected every aspect of life. People who couldn't manage their emotions effectively had difficulty maintaining relationships, making good decisions, or adapting to changing circumstances. The emotional dysregulation that characterized medieval life contributed to the social violence, family dysfunction, and community instability that made life even more difficult. The social pressure to appear strong, and accepting of their fate meant that people couldn't express their psychological suffering. Complaining about conditions was seen as sinful or rebellious. This forced people to internalize their pain, leading to even greater psychological distress. The cultural expectation that people should accept their suffering without complaint was one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of medieval society. This expectation was reinforced by religious doctrine that taught that earthly suffering was either divine punishment for sin or a test of faith. People who expressed dissatisfaction with their conditions were seen as lacking proper humility and submission to divine will. The prohibition against complaining meant that people couldn't seek support from others who might have understood their suffering. They couldn't share their fears, their despair, or their pain with family members, friends, or community members. This isolation prevented the formation of supportive relationships that might have provided some relief from psychological distress. The internalization of psychological pain created a pressure cooker effect, where emotions built up without release until they exploded in destructive ways. People might suddenly engage in violent behavior, self-harm, or other destructive acts as a way of releasing the emotional pressure that had been building up inside them. These explosions often caused additional trauma and damage to relationships. The cultural prohibition against emotional expression also prevented people from developing emotional intelligence and communication skills. They couldn't learn to identify their emotions, understand their causes, or communicate their needs effectively. This emotional literacy made it difficult to form meaningful relationships or to seek help when it was needed. The expectation of stoic acceptance also prevented people from recognizing that their suffering was not inevitable or necessary. They couldn't question the social systems that created their misery or imagine alternatives that might reduce their pain. This psychological acceptance of injustice helped maintain the oppressive social structures that caused their suffering in the first place. The psychological toll of medieval village life was comprehensive and devastating. Every aspect of human psychology, cognition, emotion, social functioning, and spiritual development, was damaged by the conditions in which people lived. The remarkable thing is not that medieval people suffered from psychological problems, but that they managed to survive at all under such psychologically hostile conditions. Perhaps nowhere were the horrors of medieval village life more apparent than in the treatment and experiences of children. Childhood as we understand it today, a time of protection, education, and gradual development, simply didn't exist in medieval village. Child mortality was staggering. Historians estimate that roughly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. This wasn't an occasional tragedy, it was the expected norm. Parents learned not to become too attached to infants, knowing that death was more likely than survival. The statistical reality of child mortality in medieval villages was so extreme that it fundamentally altered the nature of parent-child relationships and family structure. In many families, parents would have 6, 8, or even 10 children, expecting that only 2 or 3 would survive to adulthood. This constant exposure to child death created a form of anticipatory grief that shaped every aspect of family life. The emotional defense mechanisms that parents developed to cope with the likelihood of child death had profound effects on child development. Parents who couldn't afford to become emotionally attached to their children often remained emotionally distant, providing basic physical care but little emotional nurture. Children grew up knowing that their parents viewed them as potentially temporary presences in the family, creating deep insecurities about their worth and belonging. The high mortality rates also meant that surviving children often served as replacements for deceased siblings. A child might be given the name of a dead sibling, expected to fulfill the same role in the family, or constantly compared to the idealized memory of the deceased child. This created identity confusion and psychological pressure that affected the child's development throughout their life. The gender differences in child mortality were significant and reflected the social values of medieval society. Female infants were more likely to die than male infants, not just from natural causes, but from deliberate neglect or infanticide. Parents facing scarce resources would often prioritize the survival of male children, who were seen as more economically valuable. This created a demographic imbalance that affected marriage patterns, social structures, and family dynamic. The seasonal patterns of child mortality were also revealing. More children died during the winter months when food was scarce, during harvest seasons when parents were too busy to provide adequate care, and during periods of epidemic disease when the entire community was overwhelmed. These patterns show how external pressures affected families' ability to protect their most vulnerable members. The causes of child death were numerous and preventable by modern standards. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them vulnerable to diseases that would be minor inconveniences today. Contaminated water and food caused deadly digestive infection. Accidents were common in environments where children lived and worked alongside dangerous animals, tools, and fires. The diseases that killed medieval children were often slow and painful, creating additional trauma for both the dying children and their family. Dysentery, for example, would cause children to suffer for days or weeks with severe diarrhea, dehydration, and abdominal pain before finally dying. Respiratory infections would cause children to struggle for breath, developing fevers that might cause seizures or delirium before death. The lack of medical knowledge meant that parents often made their children's suffering worse through well-intentioned but harmful treatments. They might force sick children to drink contaminated water, feed them foods that worsened their digestive problems, or subject them to religious rituals that increased their physical distress. The helplessness that parents felt watching their children suffer and die was itself a form of psychological trauma. The accidents that killed children were often directly related to the dangerous environments in which they lived. Children might fall into wells, be trampled by livestock, burned in cooking fires, or injured by farming tools. The lack of safety measures meant that these accidents were common and often fatal. Children as young as 3 or 4 might be expected to work around dangerous animals or equipment, leading to injuries that would kill them immediately, or cause infections that would kill them slowly. The contaminated food and water that caused so many child deaths were often unavoidable consequences of medieval living conditions. Wells might be contaminated with human or animal waste, milk might be infected with tuberculosis or other diseases, and stored food might be infested with harmful bacteria or parasites. Parents often knew that the food and water they were giving their children was potentially dangerous, but they had no alternative available. Infanticide was practiced, though rarely discussed openly. Parents facing starvation might abandon newborn children, especially girls, who were considered less economically valuable. Some historians suggest that infanticide was so common that it significantly affected population demographics, creating gender imbalances in some regions. The practice of infanticide in medieval villages was often disguised as natural death or accident, making it difficult for modern historians to determine its true prevalence. Parents might claim that infants had died from disease or accident when they had actually been killed or allowed to die through neglect. The social taboos surrounding infanticide meant that it was rarely discussed explicitly, but indirect evidence suggests that it was far more common than official records indicate. The decision to kill or abandon an infant was often made based on cold economic calculations rather than emotional considerations. A family facing starvation might decide that killing one child would allow the others to survive, or that abandoning a newborn would preserve resources for older children who had already survived the most dangerous early years. These decisions were made by parents who were themselves desperate and traumatized, but they created additional psychological burdens for both parents and surviving children. The methods of infanticide were often designed to appear accidental or natural. Infants might be smothered during sleep, exposed to cold temperatures, or simply not fed until they died of starvation. Some parents might abandon infants in locations where they were unlikely to be found and rescued, such as forests or remote areas. The knowledge that these deaths were deliberate created guilt and trauma for parents, but the alternative, watching their entire family starve, seemed even worse. The gender bias in infanticide reflected the economic realities of medieval society. Male children were seen as potential sources of labor and economic security, while female children were often viewed as economic burdens who would eventually leave the family through marriage. This gender bias was so strong that some regions developed significant gender imbalances, with far more adult men than women. These imbalances affected marriage patterns, social structures, and family dynamics in ways that persisted for generations. The psychological effects of infanticide on surviving family members were profound and lasting. Parents who had killed or abandoned children often developed severe guilt, depression, and anxiety. Surviving children might learn about their parents' actions and develop fears about their own security and worth. The knowledge that infanticide was a possibility created a climate of fear and insecurity that affected all family relationships. Children who survived infancy faced immediate entry into the adult world of work and responsibility. By age 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute significantly to family survival. They would tend livestock, help with harvest, spin thread, and perform countless other tasks that required adult-level responsibility. The transition from infancy to child labor was abrupt and traumatic. Children who had been relatively protected during their early years suddenly found themselves expected to perform dangerous and demanding tasks. They might be given responsibility for valuable livestock, expected to work in fields alongside adults, or required to perform skilled tasks that could mean the difference between family survival and starvation. The work that children were expected to perform was often physically demanding and dangerous. Young children might be required to carry heavy loads, work in extreme weather conditions, or handle dangerous tools and animals. The physical demands of this work often exceeded their developmental capabilities, leading to injuries, exhaustion, and stunted growth. Children who were injured at work might become permanently disabled, making them burdens on their families rather than economic assets. The psychological transition from protected infant to working child was equally traumatic. Children had no time to adjust gradually to adult responsibilities or to develop the emotional and cognitive skills needed for complex tasks. They were expected to understand immediately the life or death importance of their work and to perform it with adult-level competence. The fear of making mistakes that could endanger their family's survival created intense anxiety and pressure. The work assignments given to children were often determined by their physical capabilities rather than their developmental needs. The strongest children might be assigned to heavy labor, while smaller children might be given tasks that required fine motor skills or attention to detail. There was no consideration given to the child's interests, aptitudes, or psychological readiness for particular types of work. The hours that children were expected to work were often as long as those of adults. During harvest seasons or other periods of intense labor, children might work from dawn to dusk with little rest. The physical and mental exhaustion from these long work days prevented children from engaging in play, learning, or other developmentally appropriate activity. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that children's work responsibilities varied dramatically throughout the year. During planting and harvest seasons, they might be overwhelmed with work, while during winter months they might have more time for other activities. This irregular pattern made it difficult for children to develop consistent routines or to engage in sustained learning activities. Education was non-existent for peasant children. There were no schools, no books, and no time for learning. Children learned practical skills through observation and practice, but they remained illiterate and uninformed about the world beyond their immediate village. This ignorance was intentional. Educated peasants might question their treatment or seek to escape their condition. The deliberate exclusion of peasant children from education was a form of social control that perpetuated the feudal system. Lords and religious authorities understood that educated peasants might challenge the existing social order, demand better treatment, or seek opportunities for social mobility. By keeping peasant children ignorant, they ensured that the next generation would be as easy to control as the current one. The few opportunities for learning that existed were carefully controlled and limited. Children might learn basic religious concepts through church services, but they were not taught to read or write. They might learn traditional songs or stories through oral tradition, but they were not exposed to literature, history, or philosophy that might broaden their understanding of the world. The practical skills that children learned were strictly limited to those necessary for their expected roles in society. Boys might learn farming techniques, animal husbandry, or basic crafts, while girls might learn cooking, textile production, or household management. There was no encouragement of intellectual curiosity, creative expression, or critical thinking. The absence of formal education meant that children had no opportunity to develop their intellectual potential. Children who might have been capable of advanced learning, creative problem-solving, or intellectual achievement were instead condemned to lives of ignorance and mental stagnation. The loss of human intellectual potential was one of the most tragic aspects of medieval village life. The lack of education also affected children's ability to adapt to changing circumstances or to solve problems creatively. Children who learned only through rote memorization and imitation had difficulty developing the flexible thinking skills needed to deal with new situations or challenges. This intellectual rigidity made them more vulnerable to exploitation and less capable of improving their conditions. The social isolation that resulted from lack of education was also significant. Children who couldn't read or write were cut off from the broader world of ideas and knowledge. They had no access to information about other places, other ways of life, or other possibilities for human existence. This isolation made them easier to control, but also deprived them of the intellectual stimulation that humans need for psychological development. Child labor was not just accepted, but essential for family survival. Children worked alongside adults in fields, performed dangerous tasks like tending fires or handling livestock, and were often injured or killed in work-related accidents. The concept of protecting children from hazardous work was completely foreign to medieval thinking. The integration of children into the adult workforce was complete and immediate. There was no gradual introduction to work responsibilities or consideration of developmental appropriate. Children were expected to perform at adult levels immediately and to understand the serious consequences of their work. A child who failed to properly tend livestock might cause the family to lose their primary source of food and income. The dangerous nature of much child labor meant that work-related injuries and deaths were common. Children might be kicked by horses, gored by cattle, burned by fires, or injured by farm tools. The lack of safety equipment or procedures meant that these accidents were often severe and sometimes fatal. Children who survived serious work injuries might be permanently disabled, making them unable to contribute to family survival. The types of work that children were expected to perform varied by season and family circumstances. During planting season, children might work in muddy fields, planting seeds and tending crops. During harvest, they might work long hours gathering grain, often developing repetitive stress injuries from the constant bending and lifting. In winter, they might work indoors, spinning thread or preparing food, often in poorly ventilated spaces filled with smoke and fume. The emotional toll of child labor was significant. Children who were forced to work like adults missed out on the play, exploration, and social interaction that are essential for healthy child development. They had no time for the imaginative play that helps children process their experiences and develop creativity. The constant pressure to perform adult-level work created chronic stress and anxiety that affected their psychological development. The economic value of child labor made children into commodities rather than family members. Parents might make decisions about their children's work based solely on economic considerations, without regard for the child's well-being or development. Children who were particularly skilled or strong might be worked harder than others, while those who were weak or sickly might be seen as economic burdens. The lack of labor protections meant that children could be subjected to working conditions that would be considered abusive by modern standards. They might be forced to work in extreme weather, denied adequate food or rest, or subjected to physical punishment if their work was deemed inadequate. The concept of children's rights or protections was completely foreign to medieval thinking. Physical punishment of children was brutal and routine. Parents believed that severe beatings were necessary to discipline children and prepare them for the harsh realities of adult life. Children were hit with sticks, leather straps, and other implements that would be considered weapons today. Many children suffered permanent injuries from these beatings. The philosophy behind corporal punishment of children was that physical pain was necessary for moral and social development. Parents believed that children who were not beaten would grow up to be lazy, disobedient, or morally corrupt. The beatings were seen as expressions of parental love and responsibility, rather than as abuse. This cultural acceptance of violence against children made it impossible for children to seek protection or support. The implements used for beating children were often designed to cause maximum pain and intimidation. Heavy wooden switches, leather belts with metal buckles, and even farm tools might be used to strike children. The beatings were often severe enough to cause bruising, bleeding, and permanent scarring. Children who tried to protect themselves or flee from beatings might be beaten even more severely for their disobedience. The frequency of physical punishment was extraordinary by modern standards. Children might be beaten daily for minor infractions such as speaking out of turn, moving too slowly, or failing to complete tasks perfectly. The constant threat of physical violence created a climate of fear that affected every aspect of children's lives. They learned to be hypervigilant about adult moods and expectations, constantly trying to avoid behaviors that might trigger punishment. The psychological effects of routine physical abuse were severe and lasting. Children who were beaten regularly often developed anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. They might become aggressive toward other children, withdrawn and fearful, or develop obsessive behaviors designed to avoid punishment. The chronic stress of living under the constant threat of violence affected their physical and mental development. The beatings were often accompanied by verbal abuse and humiliation designed to reinforce the child's powerlessness and worthlessness. Children might be called stupid, lazy, evil, or cursed while being beaten. This psychological abuse was as damaging as the physical violence, creating deep-seated feelings of shame and worthlessness that persisted throughout their life. The lack of any alternative discipline methods meant that physical violence was the only tool available for child management. Parents who might have preferred gentler methods had no knowledge of alternative approaches to discipline. The cultural belief that children were naturally evil and needed to be beaten into goodness made it impossible to develop more humane approaches to child rearing. The community support for corporal punishment meant that children had no refuge from abuse. Neighbors, relatives, and religious authorities all endorsed the use of physical violence against children. A child who complained about being beaten might be beaten again for their ingratitude or rebelliousness. The social isolation of abused children made their suffering even more intense. Sexual abuse of children was common and largely ignored. Children had no legal protections and were often victims of sexual violence by adults. The concept of childhood innocence didn't exist, and children were seen as miniature adults who could be treated as adults in all respects, including sexually. The vulnerability of children to sexual abuse was extreme in medieval villages. Children had no privacy, no legal protections, and no adults who were specifically responsible for their safety. They were often left alone with adult men who had complete authority over them, and who faced no consequences for sexual violence. The power imbalance between adults and children made it impossible for children to resist or report abuse. The types of sexual abuse that children experienced ranged from inappropriate touching to violent rape. Young children might be subjected to sexual acts that they couldn't understand or process psychologically. Older children might be forced into sexual relationships with adults who had economic or social power over their family. The physical trauma of sexual abuse was often compounded by infections, injuries, and unwanted pregnancies. The psychological effects of sexual abuse on medieval children were devastating. Children who were sexually abused often developed severe trauma symptoms, including nightmares, flashbacks, and dissociative episodes. They might become withdrawn and fearful, or conversely, they might become sexually aggressive toward other children. The lack of understanding about trauma meant that these symptoms were often misinterpreted as moral corruption or demonic possession. The social response to child sexual abuse was often to blame the child rather than the perpetrator. Children who reported sexual abuse might be accused of lying, seducing adults, or bringing shame on their families. The concept of children as innocent victims who needed protection from adult sexual predators was completely foreign to medieval thinking. Instead, children were seen as potential sources of temptation who might lead virtuous adults astray. The lack of consequences for perpetrators of child sexual abuse meant that the behavior was likely to continue and escalate. Adults who sexually abused children faced no legal penalties and little social disapproval. They might be mildly criticized for lack of self-control, but they were rarely punished or prevented from having access to other children. This created environments where serial predators could abuse multiple children over many years. The interconnected nature of sexual abuse and other forms of exploitation meant that sexually abused children were often also subjected to other forms of violence and neglect. Children who were sexually abused might also be beaten, starved, or forced into dangerous labor. The multiple forms of abuse created cumulative trauma that was particularly devastating to child development. The long-term effects of sexual abuse on children who survived to adulthood were severe and lasting. Adult survivors might develop problems with intimate relationships, sexual dysfunction, and chronic mental health problems. They might also perpetuate cycles of abuse by becoming abusers themselves, having learned that sexual violence was a normal part of human relationships. Marriage for children was normal, particularly for girls. Girls as young as 12 might be married off to older men, often as part of economic arrangements between families. These child marriages were typically consummated immediately, leading to pregnancies that frequently killed young mothers. The practice of child marriage was driven by economic necessity rather than romantic considerations. Families might marry off their daughters to reduce the number of mouths to feed, to create alliances with other families, or to gain economic benefits such as dowries or access to land. The welfare of the child was rarely considered in these arrangements, which were essentially business transactions using children as commodities. The age at which girls were married was often determined by their physical development, rather than their emotional or psychological readiness. A girl who began menstruating might be considered ready for marriage, regardless of her actual age or maturity level. This meant that girls as young as 11 or 12 might be married to men who were decades older and who had complete legal and social authority over them. The process of arranging child marriages was often secretive and rapid. Parents might negotiate marriages without consulting their children, and the wedding might take place within days or weeks of the arrangement. Children had no opportunity to object to the marriage or to prepare emotionally for the dramatic change in their lives. They might learn about their upcoming marriage only days before the ceremony. The immediate consummation of child marriages meant that young girls were subjected to sexual activity before they were physically or emotionally ready. The wedding night rape of child brides was considered normal and expected. Girls who resisted or showed fear were often beaten or coerced into submission. The trauma of forced sexual activity was compounded by the physical pain and injury that often resulted from sexual violence against immature bodies. The pregnancies that resulted from child marriages were extremely dangerous for young mothers. Girls whose bodies were still developing often experienced complications during pregnancy and childbirth that could be fatal. The lack of medical knowledge and care meant that many young mothers died in childbirth, often taking their babies with them. The death of child mothers was so common that it was considered a normal part of life. The psychological impact of child marriage on young girls was severe and lasting. Girls who were married as children often experienced what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma. They were separated from their families, subjected to sexual violence, and forced into adult responsibilities before they were emotionally ready. The combination of trauma, isolation, and premature responsibility often led to severe psychological problems. The social isolation of child brides was particularly damaging. Young married girls were often separated from their families and friends, moved to new villages where they knew no one, and placed under the complete control of their husbands and in-laws. They had no support system and no one to turn to for help or comfort. This isolation made them more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. The lack of education or preparation for marriage meant that child brides had no understanding of what was expected of them or how to navigate their new role. They might be expected to manage complex household responsibilities, navigate complicated family relationships, and satisfy the sexual and emotional needs of their husbands without any preparation or support. The failure to meet these expectations often led to punishment and abuse. Abandonment of children was a common response to economic hardship. Parents who couldn't feed their children might leave them at monasteries, sell them into slavery, or simply abandon them to die. Children who survived abandonment often became beggars, thieves, or victims of exploitation. The decision to abandon children was often made during times of extreme crisis, such as famine, warfare, or economic collapse. Parents facing starvation might decide that abandoning some children would allow others to survive. These decisions were made by desperate people who saw no other options, but they created additional trauma for both parents and children. The methods of child abandonment varied depending on the circumstances and the parents' resources. Wealthy families might leave children at monasteries or convents, hoping that religious institutions would provide care and education. Poor families might simply leave children on the doorsteps of churches or in public places, hoping that someone would take them in. The most desperate parents might abandon children in remote locations where they were unlikely to be found. The survival rates for abandoned children were extremely low. Most abandoned infants died within days or weeks of being left alone. Those who survived often suffered from malnutrition, exposure, and disease. The few who lived to adulthood often bore physical and psychological scars from their early abandonment and the harsh conditions they endured while trying to survive. The psychological impact of abandonment on children was devastating. Children who were old enough to understand what was happening often experienced profound feelings of rejection, worthlessness, and despair. They might blame themselves for their parents' decision to abandon them, believing that they were somehow defective or unworthy of love. These feelings of abandonment often persisted throughout their lives, affecting their ability to form trusting relationships. The children who survived abandonment often developed survival strategies that were psychologically damaging. They might become aggressive and manipulative, learning to exploit others before they could be exploited themselves. They might become withdrawn and self-reliant, unable to trust others or form meaningful relationships. The psychological adaptations that helped them survive abandonment often made it difficult for them to function in normal social relationships. The social stigma attached to abandoned children made their already difficult lives even harder. Abandoned children were often seen as cursed, illegitimate, or morally corrupt. They might be excluded from communities, denied opportunities for work or marriage, and subjected to discrimination and abuse. The social rejection that abandoned children faced reinforced their feelings of worthlessness and made it even more difficult for them to build stable, productive lives. The lack of institutional support for abandoned children meant that they had to rely on their own resources or the charity of individuals. Monasteries and convents might take in some abandoned children, but they often provided minimal care and expected the children to work for their keep. Many abandoned children became part of the growing population of beggars, thieves, and outcasts who lived on the margins of medieval society. Child slaves were common in medieval villages. Children were bought and sold like livestock, often separated from their families and forced to work in dangerous conditions. These child slaves had no legal protections and were often worked to death or killed when they became too expensive to maintain. The slave trade in children was a well-established part of medieval commerce. Children might be sold by their parents to pay debts, captured during raids or wars, or kidnapped by slave trade. The trade in child slaves was so common that it was regulated by law and taxed by authorities, showing how fully integrated it was into medieval society. The conditions under which child slaves lived were often worse than those of adult slaves. Children were seen as more expendable and less valuable than adults, so they were often given the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks. They might be forced to work in mines, clean out sewers, or perform other tasks that posed serious health risks. The mortality rate among child slaves was extremely high. The psychological impact of slavery on children was severe and lasting. Children who were enslaved often experienced what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma. They were separated from their families, subjected to physical and sexual abuse, and forced to work in dangerous conditions. The combination of trauma, isolation, and exploitation often led to severe psychological problems. The lack of legal protections for child slaves meant that they were completely at the mercy of their owners. Owners could beat, starve, or kill child slaves without facing legal consequences. The complete powerlessness of child slaves made them vulnerable to every form of abuse and exploitation. Many child slaves died from overwork, malnutrition, disease, or violence. The social acceptance of child slavery meant that these children had no hope of rescue or support from the broader community. Child slavery was seen as a normal part of medieval society, and there was no social movement or religious doctrine that opposed it. Children who tried to escape or resist their enslavement were often severely punished or killed, as examples to other slaves. The economic value of child slaves was often calculated in terms of their immediate productivity rather than their long-term potential. Owners might work child slaves to death rather than invest in their health or training, knowing that they could easily replace them with other enslaved children. This short-sighted approach to human resources meant that many child slaves died young from overwork and neglect. The psychological development of children was severely stunted by these conditions. Children who lived in constant fear, who witnessed extreme violence, who were forced into adult responsibilities before they were emotionally ready, developed psychological problems that would persist throughout their short lives. The impact of trauma on child development in medieval villages was comprehensive and devastating. Children who were exposed to violence, abuse, and extreme hardship during their formative years often developed what modern psychology would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms of this condition, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, dissociation, and difficulty forming attachments, were so common among medieval children that they were considered normal personality traits. The constant exposure to death and violence desensitized children to human suffering and made them more likely to engage in violent behavior themselves. Children who witnessed public executions, saw family members die from disease or starvation, or were themselves victims of violence, often developed callous attitudes toward human life. This desensitization was seen as a necessary adaptation to medieval life, but it prevented the development of empathy and moral reasoning. The lack of emotional support and nurturing during childhood prevented the development of secure attachment relationships. Children who couldn't trust their caregivers to protect them or meet their needs often developed insecure attachment styles that affected their relationships throughout their lives. They might become anxiously attached, constantly seeking reassurance and approval, or avoidantly attached, unable to form close relationships with others. The premature exposure to adult responsibilities and concerns prevented children from developing age-appropriate cognitive and emotional skills. Children who were forced to worry about survival, work like adults, and navigate complex social relationships before they were developmentally ready often missed critical developmental milestones. This developmental disruption had lasting effects on their ability to function as adults. The chronic stress of medieval childhood had direct effects on brain development. The constant activation of stress response systems during critical periods of brain development could permanently alter neural pathways, affecting memory, learning, and emotional regulation. Children who grew up under chronic stress often had difficulty with abstract thinking, problem solving, and emotional control as adults. The lack of play and exploration during childhood prevented the development of creativity, imagination, and social skill. Children who had no time for play missed opportunities to develop their cognitive abilities, practice social interactions, and explore their environment. The absence of play in medieval childhood was not just a loss of enjoyment, it was a loss of critical developmental opportunity. Play and recreation for children were minimal. There were no toys, games, or activities designed specifically for children, When children had free time, they might play simple games with sticks and stones, but most of their time was consumed by work and survival activity. The few opportunities for play that existed were often dangerous or inappropriate by modern standards. Children might play games that involved physical violence, such as mock battles or hunting games. They might play with dangerous objects such as knives or farm tools. The concept of age-appropriate toys or activities was completely foreign to medieval thinking. The social aspects of play were also limited by the conditions of medieval life. Children from different social classes rarely played together, and the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society were reflected in children's interaction. Children learned early that their social position determined their relationships with other children, and they often developed the same prejudices and hostilities that characterized adult society. The imaginative play that is so important for child development was often discouraged or suppressed. Children who engaged in fantasy play might be accused of lying or of being influenced by demons. The strong emphasis on religious orthodoxy and social conformity made it dangerous for children to express creativity or imagination. This suppression of imaginative play prevented the development of creative thinking and problem-solving skills. The few games that were available to children were often crude and violent. Children might play games that involved throwing stones at targets, wrestling, or other physical competition. These games often resulted in injuries and reinforced the violent nature of medieval society. The lack of gentle, cooperative games meant that children missed opportunities to develop social skills and emotional intelligence. The absence of adult supervision during play meant that children's games were often unsupervised and potentially dangerous. Children might play near dangerous animals, in unstable buildings, or with hazardous material. The lack of safety consciousness in medieval society meant that children were expected to learn about dangers through direct experience, often resulting in serious injuries or death. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that opportunities for play were limited to certain times of the year. During busy agricultural seasons, children had no time for play, while during winter months they might be confined indoors with little space for physical activity. The irregular availability of play opportunities made it difficult for children to develop consistent social relationships or recreational skills. The lack of medical care for children was particularly tragic. Childhood diseases that are easily treatable today, measles, whooping cough, dysentery, were often fatal in medieval villages. Parents could only watch helplessly as their children suffered and died from preventable conditions. The medical knowledge available for treating sick children was primitive and often harmful. Medieval physicians had no understanding of germ theory, anatomy, or pharmacology. The treatments they prescribed were often based on superstition, astrology, or religious beliefs, rather than scientific evidence. Children who received medical treatment were often made sicker by the treatments themselves. The lack of proper nutrition meant that children's immune systems were compromised from birth. Malnourished children were more susceptible to diseases and less able to recover from illness. The combination of poor nutrition and unsanitary living conditions created an environment where childhood diseases were both more common and more deadly than they would be in healthier populations. The diagnostic methods available to medieval physicians were crude and unreliable. They might diagnose childhood illnesses based on the position of the stars, the color of the child's urine, or other irrelevant factors. The lack of accurate diagnosis meant that children often received inappropriate or harmful treatments that worsened their condition. The medications available for treating sick children were often toxic or ineffective. Children might be given heavy metals, poisonous plants, or other substances that were more harmful than helpful. The lack of understanding about proper dosing meant that children were often given adult doses of medications that were too strong for their small bodies. The surgical procedures available for treating injured children were primitive and dangerous. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper surgical instruments. Children who underwent surgery often died from infection, blood loss, or shock. The lack of surgical skill meant that many conditions that could be easily treated today were fatal in medieval times. The psychological care available for sick children was minimal. There was no understanding of the emotional needs of sick children or the importance of comfort and reassurance during illness. Sick children were often isolated from their families, denied comfort objects, or subjected to religious rituals that increased their fear and distress. Children's emotional needs were largely ignored. The concept of providing emotional support, encouragement, or affection to children was foreign to medieval parenting. Children were expected to be stoic, obedient, and self-sufficient from an early age. The emotional neglect of children was systematic and comprehensive. Parents who were struggling for survival had neither the time nor the emotional resources to provide nurturing care for their children. Children were fed, clothed, and sheltered when possible, but their emotional needs were considered irrelevant to their survival and development. The lack of understanding about child psychology meant that parents had no knowledge of the emotional needs of children at different developmental stages. They didn't understand the importance of attachment, the need for emotional security, or the role of affection in healthy development. Children were treated as miniature adults who should be able to regulate their emotions and meet their own psychological needs. The harsh conditions of medieval life were seen as character-building experiences that would prepare children for adult hardship. Parents believed that children who were coddled or shown too much affection would become weak and unable to survive in the adult world. This belief justified the emotional neglect of children and prevented the development of nurturing parent-child relationships. The religious teachings of medieval society often reinforced the emotional neglect of children. Religious doctrine taught that children were born sinful and needed to be strictly controlled and disciplined. Expressions of affection or emotional support were seen as potentially corrupting influences that might make children proud or rebellious. Parents who showed too much love for their children might be accused of idolatry or of placing human relationships above their relationship with God. The social expectations for children's behavior were harsh and unforgiving. Children were expected to be silent, obedient, and grateful for whatever treatment they received. Any expression of emotional needs, crying, complaining, or seeking comfort, was seen as weakness or disobedience that required punishment. Children learned early that their emotions were dangerous and unwelcome. The lack of emotional support had lasting effects on children's psychological development. Children who grew up without affection, encouragement, or emotional validation often developed severe problems with self-esteem, emotional regulation, and social relationships. They might become adults who were unable to form meaningful relationships, who struggled with depression and anxiety, or who perpetuated cycles of emotional neglect with their own children. The few children who survived to adulthood often suffered from physical and psychological damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Malnutrition during childhood led to stunted growth, cognitive impairment, and an increased susceptibility to disease. Physical abuse caused permanent injuries and psychological trauma. The lack of education and emotional support created adults who were unprepared for the complex challenges of medieval life. The long-term consequences of medieval childhood were visible in the adult population. Adults who had survived medieval childhoods often showed signs of chronic trauma, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and difficulty forming relationships. They might be quick to anger, unable to trust others, or prone to depression and anxiety. The psychological damage of childhood often persisted throughout their lives, affecting their ability to function as parents, spouses, and community members. The physical consequences of medieval childhood were equally severe. Adults who had been malnourished as children were often shorter, weaker, and more susceptible to disease than they would have been with proper nutrition. They might have permanent disabilities from childhood injuries or illness. The premature aging caused by childhood stress and hardship meant that adults often looked and felt much older than their chronological age. The cognitive consequences of medieval childhood were particularly tragic. Adults who had been denied education and intellectual stimulation as children often had limited problem-solving abilities, poor memory, and difficulty with abstract thinking. They might be unable to adapt to new situations, learn new skills, or understand complex concepts. The loss of human intellectual potential was one of the most devastating consequences of medieval childhood. The social consequences of medieval childhood affected entire communities. Adults who had been traumatized as children often had difficulty forming stable relationships, participating in community activities, or contributing to social cohesion. They might be suspicious of others, quick to resort to violence, or unable to cooperate effectively. The social dysfunction that resulted from widespread childhood trauma contributed to the instability and violence that characterized medieval society. The intergenerational transmission of trauma meant that the effects of medieval childhood were passed down from parents to children. Adults who had been abused, neglected, or traumatized as children often became abusive, neglectful, or traumatizing parents themselves. The cycle of trauma and dysfunction was perpetuated across generations, creating a society where childhood suffering was normalized and expected. The remarkable aspect of medieval childhood was not that it was brutal and traumatic, but that any children managed to survive and develop into functional adults. The resilience of the human spirit, even under the most adverse conditions, was demonstrated by the children who found ways to adapt, survive, and sometimes even thrive despite the overwhelming challenges they faced. Their survival was a testament to the fundamental human capacity for endurance and adaptation, even in the face of systematic cruelty and neglect. Medieval village life followed a relentless seasonal cycle, where each time of year brought its own unique forms of suffering and challenge. Understanding this cycle reveals how medieval peasants lived in constant anticipation of the next crisis, with no season offering true relief from hardship. Winter was the season of death. As temperatures dropped and daylight hours shortened, villages became prisons of cold, darkness, and despair. Most peasant homes had no effective heating systems beyond small fires that provided minimal warmth, while filling living spaces with dangerous smoke. People would huddle together for warmth, often sharing beds with entire families and even livestock. Food scarcity reached its peak during winter months. The previous year's harvest had to last until spring, but storage methods were primitive and unreliable. Grain stores would run low, preserved meat would spoil, and people would begin the slow process of starvation. By late winter, many villagers were eating bark, roots, and anything else they could find to fill their empty stomachs. The psychological impact of winter was devastating. The combination of cold, hunger, and darkness created a depression that affected entire communities. People would spend months in small, crowded spaces, with no privacy, no comfort, and no hope that conditions would improve. Domestic violence increased during winter months, as stress and desperation took their toll on family relationships. Spring brought new challenges despite the promise of warmer weather. This was known as the hungry season, because stored food supplies were exhausted, but new crops hadn't yet matured. People were at their weakest point physically, having survived months of malnutrition and cold. Many who had survived winter would die in spring, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated stress. The agricultural work of spring was particularly brutal because it came when people were physically weakest. Plowing fields with primitive tools required enormous energy that malnourished peasants barely possessed. The urgent need to plant crops for the next harvest meant that people would work despite exhaustion, illness, and injury. Spring flooding was a constant threat. Medieval villages were often built near rivers for water access, but this made them vulnerable to floods that could destroy homes, contaminate water supplies, and wash away planted crops. A single flood could doom a village to starvation in the following winter. Summer brought its own forms of suffering. The heat made the already unbearable smells of medieval villages even worse. Human and animal waste, rotting food, and poor sanitation created a stench that would be overwhelming to modern sensibility. The heat, also increased the risk of food spoilage and disease transmission. Agricultural work during summer was back-breaking. Peasants would work from dawn to dusk in fields, under the blazing sun, often without adequate water or rest. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common, and many people died from the physical stress of summer labor. Insect infestations were particularly bad during summer months. Flies, mosquitoes, and other pests would swarm around villages, spreading disease and making life miserable. These insects were attracted to the waste and filth that accumulated in medieval communities, creating health hazards that people had no effective way to combat. Autumn was dominated by the desperate race to harvest and preserve enough food to survive the coming winter. This was the most important time of year, when the success or failure of agricultural work would determine who lived and who died in the months ahead. The pressure was enormous, and entire communities would work frantically to bring in crops before weather could destroy them. The psychological stress of autumn was intense. People knew that their survival depended on the success of the harvest, but they also knew that their efforts might be destroyed by a single storm, attack by bandits, or outbreak of disease. The uncertainty created anxiety that affected entire communities. Harvest time was also when feudal obligations were collected. Lords would take their share of crops at the moment when peasants most needed food for winter survival. This created agonizing decisions about how to allocate scarce resources between feudal obligations and family survival. The religious calendar imposed additional stresses on the seasonal cycle. Fasting periods during Lent meant that people had to restrict their already inadequate food intake. Religious festivals required contributions that poor families could barely afford. The Church's control over the calendar meant that religious obligations often conflicted with practical survival needs. Weather was completely unpredictable and often catastrophic. Medieval people had no weather forecasting, no early warning systems, and no effective protection against extreme weather. A single storm could destroy crops, homes, and lives without warning. People lived in constant fear of weather-related disasters that could strike at any time. The cycle repeated endlessly, with each year bringing the same challenges and the same suffering. There was no progress, no improvement, no hope that future years might be better. People knew that they would face the same struggles every year until death finally released them from the cycle. The medical realities of medieval village life were perhaps more horrifying than any other aspect of daily existence. The combination of primitive medical knowledge, dangerous treatments, and complete lack of understanding about disease created a healthcare system that often killed more people than it helped. Medieval medical theory was based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humours, and treatment involved trying to restore balance through methods that were often more dangerous than the original illness. Bloodletting was the most common medical treatment, used for everything from headaches to pneumonia. Doctors would cut veins, apply leeches, or use cupping techniques to remove excess blood from patients. This practice was not only ineffective but actively harmful, weakening already sick patients and often causing fatal blood loss or infection. Purging was another standard treatment that involved forcing patients to vomit or defecate through the use of powerful herbs and chemicals. These substances were often toxic and could cause severe dehydration, organ damage, or death. The theory was that expelling bodily fluids would restore humoral balance, but the practice often killed patients outright. Surgical procedures were nightmarishly primitive. There were no anesthetics, no understanding of sterile conditions, and no effective pain management. Surgery was performed with crude tools in filthy conditions, often by people with no medical training. Most surgical patients died either from shock during the procedure or from infection afterward. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was a common treatment for headaches, mental illness, and head injuries. This procedure was performed with simple tools and no anesthesia. Patients would be held down while doctors drilled into their skulls, often causing brain damage or death. The procedure was based on the belief that releasing evil spirits or pressure would cure illness. Cauterization, burning wounds with hot irons, was used to treat everything from cuts to internal disease. The theory was that heat would purify wounds and prevent infection, but the practice often caused severe burns and additional tissue damage. Many patients died from the shock and trauma of cauterization. Herbal remedies were sometimes helpful but often dangerous. Many medieval treatments involved powerful plant-based drugs that could be toxic in the wrong dosages. Mercury, arsenic, and other poisonous substances were commonly used as medicines, often causing mercury poisoning or other forms of toxicity. The concept of contagion was poorly understood. Medieval people recognized that some diseases spread from person to person, but they had no understanding of germs or bacterial infection. They believed that disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment, leading to treatments that were completely ineffective. Quarantine practices were primitive and often counterproductive. During plague outbreaks, entire families would be sealed inside their homes, often trapping healthy people with the infected. These quarantine measures frequently made disease outbreaks worse, rather than better. Mental illness was completely misunderstood. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions were thought to be possessed by demons or punished by God for moral failures. Treatment might involve exorcism, physical restraint, or even execution as a witch or heretic. Pain management was virtually non-existent. Medieval people had no effective methods for controlling pain, and many medical procedures were performed on fully conscious patients. The psychological trauma of experiencing extreme pain without relief was often as damaging as the physical injury itself. Dental care was primitive and dangerous. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia using crude tools. Dental abscesses were common and often fatal, as infection could spread to the brain or heart. Many people died from dental problems that would be easily treatable today. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mothers and babies. Midwives had no understanding of sterile conditions, no effective pain relief, and no emergency procedures for complications. Maternal mortality rates were extraordinarily high, and many women died from infections, hemorrhaging, or other complications. The treatment of broken bones was primitive and often ineffective. Fractures were set without X-rays or proper alignment, often healing incorrectly and causing permanent disability. Many people who broke bones became permanently disabled or died from complications. Wound care was dangerous and often counterproductive. Wounds were often packed with materials that were contaminated with bacteria, leading to serious infections. The lack of understanding about antiseptic care meant that minor injuries often became life-threatening conditions. The cost of medical care was prohibitive for most villagers. Even the primitive treatments available were expensive and often required payment in goods or services that poor families couldn't afford. This meant that most people received no medical care at all, relying instead on folk remedies or simply accepting their fate. The cumulative effect of all these hardships was the complete erosion of human dignity. Medieval village life stripped away every aspect of what modern people would consider basic human rights, and reduced people to a state of existence that was barely above that of animals. Privacy was non-existent. Peasant families lived in one-room cottages where multiple generations shared sleeping, eating, and living spaces. Personal hygiene was performed in public. Marital intimacy occurred in the presence of children and other family members. There was no concept of personal space or individual privacy. The typical peasant dwelling measured roughly 12 by 20 feet, housing an average of 8 to 10 people across 3 generations. Grandparents, parents, and children all shared the same straw-covered floor for sleeping. The single room served as bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and storage space simultaneously. Bodily functions were performed in the presence of the entire family, with chamber pots used openly, without shame or privacy. Women gave birth in full view of the household, their labor pains witnessed by children who learned early that privacy was a luxury they would never know. The lack of individual sleeping spaces meant that married couples had no opportunity for private intimacy. Sexual relations occurred while children and elderly relatives lay mere feet away, often pretending sleep while parents engaged in the most private of human activity. This constant exposure to adult sexuality had profound psychological effects on children, who developed distorted understandings of human relationships and personal boundaries. Personal belongings were virtually non-existent. Peasants owned so few possessions that the concept of personal property was meaningless. A family might own a single change of clothes, shared eating utensils, and basic tools that belonged to the entire household. Children had no toys, books, or personal items that were exclusively theirs. The idea that individuals might have private spaces for their possessions was incomprehensible in medieval village life. Personal autonomy was illegal. Peasants couldn't make basic decisions about their own lives, where to live, what work to do, whom to marry, or even where to travel. Every aspect of existence was controlled by lords, priests, and social customs that treated people as property rather than individuals. The manorial system legally bound peasants to the land, making them essentially property of the estate. They could not leave the manor without permission, could not choose their occupation, and had no say in their living condition. Marriage required the lord's approval, and peasants were often forced to marry specific individuals chosen by their superiors to maintain bloodlines or consolidate property holding. Career choices were determined entirely by birth and social position. Sons inherited their father's occupation whether they had aptitude for it or not. A blacksmith's son would become a blacksmith, regardless of whether he had the physical strength or mental acuity for the work. Daughters had even fewer options, typically limited to marriage or joining religious orders, with the specific choice usually made by their families rather than themselves. Geographic mobility was strictly controlled through a complex system of permissions and obligations. Peasants needed written permission to travel even short distances, and such permissions were rarely granted. The concept of exploration, adventure, or seeking better opportunities in distant places was completely foreign to medieval peasants, who lived and died within a radius of perhaps 10 miles from their birthplace. The legal system reinforced this lack of autonomy through harsh punishments for those who attempted to assert individual will. Peasants who tried to leave their assigned roles faced imprisonment, physical punishment, or death. The social structure was maintained through systematic suppression of individual initiative and desire for self-determination. Bodily autonomy was non-existent. People had no control over their own bodies. They could be physically punished, sexually abused, or medically treated without consent. The concept that individuals had rights over their own bodies was completely foreign to medieval thinking. Physical punishment was routine and accepted as necessary for maintaining social order. Lords could beat peasants for minor infractions. Priests could order physical penance for spiritual failures, and masters could punish apprentices without restraint. The human body was viewed as a tool for labor and an object for discipline, not as something belonging to the individual. Sexual violence was endemic and largely unpunished. Women and children had no legal protection against sexual assault, and the concept of consent was meaningless in a society where individuals had no rights over their own bodies. Lords exercised droit du seigneur, the right of the first night, over peasant brides, and sexual abuse by clergy was common and rarely prosecuted. Medical treatment was performed without consent or explanation. Patients had no right to refuse treatment, ask questions about procedures, or seek second opinions. The primitive medical knowledge of the time meant that most treatments were harmful, but patients had no choice but to submit to whatever procedures were deemed necessary by healers or religious authorities. The bodies of peasants were also subject to involuntary medical experimentation. Barber surgeons and religious healers would try new treatments on peasants without their knowledge or consent, viewing them as suitable subjects for testing dangerous procedures. The results of these experiments were rarely recorded, but the suffering they caused was immense. Economic freedom was impossible. Peasants couldn't own property, start businesses, or accumulate wealth. They were trapped in economic relationships that were designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal compensation. The feudal system was essentially organized theft on a massive scale. The economic obligations of peasants were so comprehensive that they effectively prevented any possibility of financial independence. Peasants owed labor service to their lord, typically 3 to 4 days per week, rent for their land holdings, taxes to the church, usually 10% of their produce, and various fees for using mills, ovens, and other essential services. These obligations often consumed 70–80% of a peasant's productive output, leaving barely enough for survival. The prohibition on owning land meant that peasants could never build equity or pass wealth to their children. They were permanently trapped in relationships of economic dependence, unable to accumulate the capital necessary for improving their conditions or starting independent enterprises. The feudal system was specifically designed to prevent peasants from achieving economic autonomy. Trade and commerce were heavily regulated and restricted. Peasants could not engage in most forms of commerce without permission and payment of fees. They were prohibited from competing with established merchants and craftsmen, and their movements were too restricted to allow for the development of trade relationships. The economic system was designed to maintain existing hierarchies, rather than reward innovation or hard work. The concept of entrepreneurship was not just discouraged, but actively punished. Peasants who attempted to start businesses or develop new methods of production faced legal penalties and social ostracism. The feudal system required that economic activity remain within established patterns that maintained the power of the ruling classes. Religious freedom didn't exist. Everyone was required to follow the same religious beliefs and practices, regardless of personal conviction. Religious dissent was punished by torture, exile, or death. The church controlled not just spiritual life but also political, economic, and social relationships. The Catholic Church held absolute authority over spiritual life, demanding complete conformity to its teachings and practice. Peasants were required to attend Mass, participate in religious festivals, and contribute to church finances regardless of their personal beliefs or financial circumstances. Questioning religious doctrine was considered heresy and could result in excommunication, torture, or death. The Inquisition represented the ultimate expression of religious oppression, using systematic torture and execution to enforce religious conformity. Even minor deviations from orthodox belief could result in investigation, torture, and the psychological terror created by the Inquisition affected entire communities, as people lived in constant fear of being accused of heretical thoughts or practices. Religious obligations consumed enormous amounts of time and resource. Peasants were required to observe numerous religious holidays, participate in lengthy religious ceremonies, and contribute labor for church construction and maintenance. These obligations often conflicted with agricultural needs, forcing peasants to choose between spiritual compliance and physical survival. The church also controlled education, marriage, and family life. Religious authorities determined what children could learn, whom they could marry, and how they should live their daily lives. The integration of religious and secular authority meant that there was no aspect of life that escaped religious control. Intellectual freedom was supreme. Education was limited to a tiny elite, and questioning established knowledge was dangerous. People were expected to accept religious and social teachings without question. Independent thinking was considered dangerous and was actively discouraged. Literacy rates among peasants were essentially zero, with perhaps 1 to 2% of the rural population able to read or write. This illiteracy was not accidental, but was deliberately maintained to prevent peasants from accessing information that might challenge the established order. Books were rare and expensive, and peasants had no access to libraries or schools. The few peasants who showed intellectual aptitude were either recruited into religious orders, where their thinking could be controlled, or were actively discouraged from pursuing education. Parents who attempted to educate their children beyond basic survival skills faced social pressure and sometimes legal penalties. Scientific inquiry was virtually impossible under these conditions. The combination of religious orthodoxy, lack of education, and social pressure prevented the development of scientific thinking. Peasants were expected to accept traditional explanations for natural phenomena without question, and those who expressed curiosity about the natural world were viewed with suspicion. The oral tradition that preserved knowledge was heavily censored and controlled. Stories, songs, and folklore were monitored by religious and secular authorities to ensure they supported existing power structures. Independent artistic expression was rare and dangerous, as creative individuals risked being accused of heresy or sedition. The concept of consent was meaningless. People were married without their consent, forced into labor without their consent, and subjected to medical procedures without their consent. The idea that individuals should have the right to make decisions about their own lives was considered absurd. Marriage arrangements were made by families or lords without consulting the individuals involved. Young people often met their spouses for the first time on their wedding day, having had no opportunity to develop emotional connections or assess compatibility. The idea that marriage should be based on love, mutual attraction, or personal choice was completely foreign to medieval thinking. Labor arrangements were similarly coercive. Peasants were assigned work duties without regard to their preferences, abilities, or physical limitations. Children were forced into adult labor as soon as they were physically capable, with no consideration for their developmental needs or personal inclinations. Legal proceedings occurred without the consent or participation of those affected. Peasants could be tried, convicted, and punished without having any say in their own defense. The legal system was designed to maintain order and protect the interests of the ruling classes, not to ensure justice or protect individual rights. Even religious participation was coercive rather than voluntary. While peasants were expected to demonstrate religious devotion, their participation in religious activities was mandatory rather than chosen. The concept that spiritual life should be a matter of personal choice and conviction was unknown in medieval society. Social mobility was impossible. People were trapped in the social class they were born into, with no possibility of improvement. This created a sense of hopelessness and despair that affected entire communities. People knew that their suffering was permanent and that their children would inherit the same condition. The three-estate system, those who fight, those who pray, those who work, was viewed as divinely ordained and immutable. Peasants were taught that their lowly position was part of God's plan, and that attempting to change their social status was both futile and sinful. This religious justification for social inequality made resistance seem not just impossible, but morally wrong. The few opportunities for social advancement that existed were heavily controlled and extremely rare. Joining the clergy offered the only realistic path to higher social status, but this required abandoning family ties and accepting a life of celibacy and religious obedience. Military service occasionally offered opportunities for advancement, but these were typically reserved for those with some existing social connections. The guild system in towns offered some possibilities for skilled craftsmen to improve their status, but these opportunities were not available to rural peasants. The apprenticeship system was designed to maintain existing hierarchies rather than provide opportunities for advancement, and most guild positions were hereditary. The psychological impact of permanent social stagnation was profound. People developed what modern psychology would recognize as learned helplessness, becoming passive and resigned to their fate. The knowledge that their children would inherit the same conditions created additional despair, as parents could not even hope for better futures for their offspring. Legal rights were minimal or non-existent. Peasants had no legal recourse against abuse, theft, or violence. The legal system was designed to protect the interests of the nobility and clergy, not to provide justice for ordinary people. Most peasants never had access to legal representation or fair trials. The manorial court system provided the only legal forum available to peasants, but these courts were controlled by the very lords who exploited them. Peasants could not appeal decisions to higher courts, could not hire legal representation, and had no protection against arbitrary punishment. The legal system was designed to maintain feudal relationships rather than provide justice. Criminal justice was brutal, and arbitrary. Peasants accused of crimes faced torture, mutilation, or death without due process. The concept of presumption of innocence was unknown, and accusations were often treated as proof of guilt. The methods used to determine guilt, such as trial by ordeal, were based on superstition rather than evidence. Civil disputes were resolved through systems that favored those with power and wealth. Peasants who had conflicts with their lords or other powerful individuals had no realistic hope of achieving justice. The legal system was designed to maintain existing power relationships rather than resolve disputes fairly. The lack of legal protection made peasants vulnerable to abuse by anyone with higher social status. Lords could seize peasant property, assault peasants physically, or impose arbitrary punishments without facing any legal consequence. This legal vulnerability created a climate of fear that affected all aspects of peasant life. The dignity of work was destroyed. Medieval peasants didn't work to achieve personal goals or contribute to society. They worked because they were forced to do so. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and provided no sense of accomplishment or purpose. People were reduced to labor animals. Agricultural work in medieval villages was characterized by its monotony and brutality. Peasants performed the same backbreaking tasks year after year, with no opportunity for innovation or improvement. The work was dangerous, with frequent injuries from tools, animals, and accidents. The primitive technology available meant that enormous physical effort was required to accomplish basic tasks. The seasonal nature of agricultural work created periods of intense labor, followed by periods of enforced idleness. During planting and harvest seasons, peasants worked from dawn to dusk, in conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. During winter months, they faced unemployment and starvation, with no productive work available. The lack of specialization meant that peasants had to perform many different types of work, none of which they could master or take pride in. They were expected to be farmers, builders, craftsmen, and laborers simultaneously, without having the opportunity to develop expertise in any particular area. This prevented the development of professional identity or skilled crafts. The fruits of peasant labor were immediately extracted by their superiors, leaving workers with no sense of accomplishment or reward for their efforts. Peasants could work harder and produce more without seeing any improvement in their own condition. This disconnect between effort and reward destroyed motivation and created a culture of minimal effort and resentment. Family relationships were distorted by the harsh conditions. Parents couldn't protect their children from abuse, starvation, or death. Children were forced to work rather than play or learn. Marriage was an economic arrangement rather than a personal relationship. The stress of survival often destroyed the emotional bonds that make families meaningful. The high infant mortality rate meant that parents had to maintain emotional distance from their children to protect themselves from constant grief. Many parents did not name their children until they survived their first year, and emotional investment in children was limited by the realistic expectation that many would die young. This emotional detachment had profound effects on child development and family bond. Children were viewed as economic assets rather than individuals with their own needs and rights. They were put to work as soon as they were physically capable, often by age. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development was unknown, and children were expected to contribute to family survival from an early age. Marriage was typically arranged by families or lords based on economic considerations rather than personal compatibility or affection. Couples often had no opportunity to develop emotional connections before marriage, and the stress of survival often prevented the development of strong marital bonds. Domestic violence was common and accepted as normal. The constant struggle for survival created family dynamics based on competition rather than cooperation. Family members competed for limited food, shelter, and resources, creating conflicts that destroyed family harmony. The stress of poverty and oppression often led to violence within families, as people took out their frustrations on those closest to them. Personal expression was suppressed. People couldn't express their thoughts, feelings, or creativity without risking punishment. Art, music, and literature were controlled by religious and political authorities. Individual personality and expression were considered dangerous threats to social order. Artistic expression was limited to religious themes approved by church authority. Peasants who showed artistic ability were either recruited into religious service or were discouraged from pursuing their talents. The few forms of popular art that existed, folk songs, stories, and crafts, were heavily monitored and censored to ensure they supported existing power structures. Music and storytelling were used primarily for religious instruction and social control rather than entertainment or personal expression. The songs and stories that peasants heard reinforced messages about social hierarchy, religious obedience, and acceptance of their lowly state. Independent artistic expression was viewed as potentially subversive and was actively discouraged. The lack of literacy meant that peasants had no access to literature or written forms of expression. The oral tradition that preserved cultural knowledge was controlled by religious and secular authorities, who determined what stories could be told and how they should be interpreted. Personal style and appearance were strictly regulated by sumptuary laws that determined what clothing, jewelry, and decorations people could wear based on their social status. Peasants were required to wear rough, undyed clothing that immediately identified their low social position. Any attempt to dress above their station was punished as a form of social rebellion. The concept of human potential was meaningless. People had no opportunity to develop their talents, pursue their interests, or achieve their goals. The vast majority of human potential was wasted as people were forced to focus entirely on basic survival. The rigid social structure meant that individual talents and abilities were relevant to life outcomes. A peasant with exceptional intelligence, artistic ability, or leadership skills had no more opportunity for advancement than one with average abilities. The system was designed to maintain existing hierarchies rather than reward merit or talent. Educational opportunities were so limited that most people never discovered their intellectual capabilities. The few peasants who showed exceptional ability were either recruited into religious orders, where their talents could be controlled, or were actively discouraged from developing their skills. The vast majority of human potential was simply wasted. The focus on survival meant that people had no time or energy to pursue personal interests or develop their talents. The constant demands of agricultural work, combined with the need to fulfill feudal obligations, left no room for intellectual or creative development. People lived and died without ever having the opportunity to discover what they might have achieved under better circumstances. The psychological impact of wasted potential was profound. People developed a sense of resignation and hopelessness that affected their entire world. They knew that their talents and abilities would never be recognized or rewarded, and this knowledge contributed to the overall despair of medieval village life. Hope for the future was systematically destroyed. Medieval people knew that their lives would never improve, that their children would suffer as they had suffered, and that there was no possibility of escape from their conditions. This hopelessness was perhaps the most dehumanizing aspect of medieval life. The religious teaching that earthly suffering was divinely ordained and that reward would come only in the afterlife effectively discouraged people from working to improve their condition. Peasants were taught that their lowly status was part of God's plan and that attempting to change their circumstances was both futile and sinful. The cyclical nature of medieval life, the same seasonal patterns, the same feudal obligations, the same social restrictions, created a sense of eternal repetition without progress. People could see no possibility of change or improvement, and this created a psychological state of learned helplessness that affected entire communities. The knowledge that their children would inherit the same conditions created additional despair. Parents could not even hope for better futures for their offspring, as the social system was designed to maintain existing hierarchies across generations. This intergenerational transmission of despair created communities characterized by resignation and hopelessness. The lack of historical awareness meant that peasants had no knowledge of better times or different social arrangements. They could not imagine alternatives to their current conditions, because they had no knowledge of other possibilities. This ignorance of alternatives made their situation seem natural and inevitable rather than the result of specific social and economic arrangements. The social institutions that might have provided support, government, religion, education, healthcare, were all designed to maintain the oppressive system rather than help people. There was no safety net, no social services, and no organizations working to improve conditions for ordinary people. Government institutions were designed to extract resources from peasants, rather than provide services to them. The feudal system was essentially a protection racket, where peasants provided labor and resources to lords in exchange for theoretical protection that was often inadequate or entirely absent. Religious institutions, while providing some spiritual comfort, were primarily focused on maintaining social order and extracting resources from peasants. The church owned vast amounts of land and wealth, while teaching peasants that poverty was spiritually beneficial. Religious institutions reinforced the existing social hierarchy rather than working to improve conditions for the poor. Educational institutions were designed to serve the needs of the elite, rather than provide opportunities for peasants. The few schools that existed were restricted to the children of nobility and clergy, and they focused on maintaining existing power structures rather than developing human potential or improving social conditions. Healthcare institutions were primitive and often harmful. The medical knowledge of the time was so limited that most treatments were ineffective or counterproductive. Healthcare was also expensive and largely unavailable to peasants, who had to rely on folk remedies and religious healing that were often ineffective. The absence of effective social institutions meant that peasants had no recourse when they faced problems or crises. They could not appeal to government for justice, could not rely on religious institutions for material support, could not access education to improve their circumstances, and could not obtain effective healthcare when they were sick or injured. Medieval villages existed in a world where environmental catastrophes were regular occurrences that could destroy entire communities without warning. The combination of climate instability, primitive technology, and poor understanding of natural disasters created a situation where people lived in constant fear of environmental destruction. The medieval climate anomaly, also known as the medieval warm period, occurred from roughly 950 to 1250 CE, followed by the Little Ice Age from 1300. These climate changes had devastating effects on agricultural communities that had no ability to adapt to changing conditions. During the medieval warm period, temperatures in Europe rose by approximately 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, which might seem beneficial but actually created complex challenges for medieval communities. The warming period led to expanded agriculture into marginal lands, creating larger populations that became vulnerable when temperatures began to decline. Communities established in highland areas or northern regions during the warm period found themselves unable to sustain agriculture when the climate cooled. The transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age was gradual but devastating. The cooling trend began around 1250 CE and accelerated through the 14th century. Growing seasons shortened by 2 to 4 weeks, which was catastrophic for agricultural communities that depended on precise timing for planting and harvest. The shortened growing seasons meant that crops that had been reliable for generations suddenly began failing regularly. The Little Ice Age brought severe winters that lasted longer and were more intense than anything in living memory. Rivers and lakes froze solid for months, cutting off transportation and water supplies. The Thames in London froze regularly during this period, and the Baltic Sea froze completely in some years, allowing people to walk between countries. These extreme conditions created challenges that medieval technology and social organization were completely unable to address. Drought was one of the most feared environmental disasters. Medieval agriculture was entirely dependent on rainfall, and extended dry periods could destroy crops across vast regions. The lack of irrigation systems, water storage, or drought-resistant crops meant that communities were completely vulnerable to precipitation patterns. The drought of 1315–1317 was particularly devastating, affecting most of northern Europe and causing widespread famine, The lack of rain during critical growing periods meant that crops failed across vast regions, creating food shortages that affected millions of. The social and economic systems of the time were completely unable to address food shortages of this magnitude. Regional droughts could last for multiple years, creating cascading disasters that affected entire kingdoms. The drought of 1331-1334 contributed to the social instability that preceded the Black Death, as weakened and malnourished populations became more vulnerable to disease. The psychological impact of prolonged drought was severe, as communities watched their crops wither and knew that starvation was inevitable. The lack of weather forecasting meant that droughts struck without warning. Medieval communities had no ability to predict weather patterns or prepare for extended dry periods. They relied on traditional indicators like animal behavior or astronomical observations, but these methods were unreliable and often led to false confidence or unnecessary panic. When droughts occurred, they often lasted for years, creating cascading disasters that affected entire regions. Crop failures led to famine, which weakened populations and made them vulnerable to disease. Livestock died from lack of water and food, eliminating crucial sources of protein and lake wells, and springs would dry up, forcing people to travel long distances for water or to drink from contaminated sources. The economic impact of drought was severe and long-lasting. Failed harvests meant that peasants could not meet their feudal obligations, leading to punishment and additional hardship. The lack of surplus grain meant that communities had no reserves to carry them through subsequent difficult periods. The death of livestock eliminated sources of labor for plowing and transportation, making recovery even more difficult. Social tensions increased dramatically during drought periods. Communities that had coexisted peacefully during normal times began competing violently for scarce water and food resources. The stress of watching families starve led to increased domestic violence, child abandonment, and social breakdown. Religious authorities often interpreted droughts as divine punishment, leading to increased persecution of marginalized groups. Flooding was equally devastating. Medieval villages were often built near rivers and streams for water access, but this made them vulnerable to floods that could destroy homes, contaminate water supplies, and wash away planted crops. Spring flooding was particularly dangerous because it could destroy newly planted crops, dooming communities to starvation. The lack of flood control systems meant that even minor rivers could become deadly torrents during heavy rain. Medieval communities had no ability to predict floods, control water flow, or protect their settlements from flood damage. The primitive construction techniques used in medieval buildings offered no protection against floodwaters, and most structures would be destroyed or severely damaged by flooding. Flash floods were particularly dangerous because they occurred with no warning. A sudden storm upstream could create a wall of water that would sweep through villages in minutes, destroying everything in its path. The lack of communication systems meant that communities could not warn each other of approaching floods, and many people were killed while going about their daily activities. The contamination of water supplies during floods created additional health hazards. Floodwaters would mix with sewage, animal waste, and decaying organic matter, creating conditions that spread disease rapidly through communities. The lack of understanding about waterborne diseases meant that people often continued to use contaminated water sources, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other diseases. Entire villages could be swept away by floods, with no warning systems to allow evacuation. The primitive construction of medieval buildings offered no protection against floodwaters, and most possessions would be destroyed or lost. The loss of stored grain and preserved food during floods often meant that communities faced starvation even after the floodwaters receded. Recovery from flooding was extremely difficult. The destruction of homes, tools, and stored food meant that communities had to rebuild from nothing. The contamination of agricultural land by floodwaters often made it unusable for years, forcing communities to abandon their traditional settlements and seek new locations. Severe storms were catastrophic for medieval communities. Without weather forecasting, storms would strike without warning, destroying crops that were ready for harvest. Hailstorms could destroy entire harvests in minutes, creating instant famine conditions. High winds could destroy buildings, kill livestock, and injure people who had no shelter. The construction techniques used in medieval buildings made them particularly vulnerable to storm damage. Most peasant houses were built with wooden frames, thatched roofs, and mud or wattle walls that offered no protection against high wind. A severe storm could destroy an entire village in hours, leaving residents without shelter or protection. Hailstorms were particularly devastating because they could destroy crops that were almost ready for harvest. The timing of hailstorms was crucial. A hailstorm during the growing season might damage crops but allow for some recovery, while a hailstorm just before harvest could destroy an entire year's food supply. The lack of weather forecasting meant that communities had no warning of approaching hailstorms and no ability to protect their crops. The seasonal nature of agriculture made storms particularly dangerous during critical periods. A storm during planting season could prevent crops from being planted. A storm during harvest could destroy food that was essential for winter survival. The timing of storms was often as important as their intensity. Windstorms could destroy not only buildings, but also crucial infrastructure like mills, bridges, and roads. The loss of a mill could force an entire community to travel long distances to process grain, while the destruction of bridges could cut off trade routes and isolate communities. The primitive technology available made rebuilding after storm damage extremely difficult and time-consuming. The psychological impact of severe storms was profound. The lack of warning systems meant that people lived in constant fear of the next storm. The knowledge that a single storm could destroy everything they had worked for created chronic anxiety that affected entire communities. The religious interpretation of storms as divine punishment added spiritual terror to physical. Volcanic eruptions, even those occurring thousands of miles away, could affect medieval European climate and agriculture. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 caused global climate disruption, but similar events occurred throughout the medieval period. These eruptions could cause years of cold weather, crop failures, and famine. The eruption of the Icelandic volcano Laki in 1783 had devastating effects on European agriculture and climate. The volcanic ash and gases released by the eruption created a haze that blocked sunlight and cooled temperatures across Europe. The resulting crop failures contributed to the social unrest that preceded the French Revolution. Similar eruptions during the medieval period had comparable effects on agricultural communities. The lack of scientific understanding meant that medieval people had no knowledge of how volcanic eruptions could affect climate. They interpreted the strange weather patterns and crop failures that followed eruptions as supernatural phenomena or divine punishment. This lack of understanding made the psychological impact of volcanic effects even more severe. The global nature of volcanic effects meant that multiple regions could be affected simultaneously, preventing communities from relying on trade or assistance from unaffected areas. When volcanic eruptions caused widespread crop failures, entire continents could face food shortages simultaneously, making recovery much more difficult. The long-term effects of volcanic eruptions could last for several years, creating extended periods of agricultural failure and social instability. The cooling effects of volcanic ash could reduce growing seasons and crop yields for multiple years, creating cascading disasters that affected entire generations. Forest fires were common and destructive. Medieval communities depended on forests for fuel, building materials and food sources like nuts and berries. Large forest fires could destroy these resources and also threaten villages directly. The lack of firefighting technology meant that fires would burn until they ran out of fuel or were extinguished by rain. The extensive forests of medieval Europe were particularly vulnerable to fire during dry periods. The lack of fire management techniques meant that fires could spread unchecked across vast areas, destroying resources that communities depended on for survival. The loss of forests could force communities to travel long distances for fuel and building materials, making life even more difficult. Forest fires often started from human activities like slash and burn agriculture, charcoal production, or iron smelting. The lack of fire safety knowledge meant that people often engaged in dangerous practices that could start. Once fires began, the primitive technology available made them virtually impossible to control or extinguish. The smoke and ash from forest fires could affect air quality over vast areas, causing respiratory problems and other health issues. The lack of understanding about air quality meant that people continued to engage in normal activities, even when air conditions were dangerous. The psychological impact of seeing vast areas of forest destroyed by fire was severe, as communities knew that their resources were being permanently lost. The ecological effects of forest fires were long-lasting. The destruction of forests could change local climate patterns, affect water supplies, and eliminate habitat for animals that communities depended on for food. The recovery of forests could take generations, meaning that the effects of major fires could last for decades. Locust swarms and other insect infestations could destroy crops across vast regions. These biological disasters were unpredictable and unstoppable with medieval technology. When locust swarms arrived, they would consume everything green, leaving communities facing immediate starvation. The desert locust swarms that occasionally reached Europe from Africa were particularly devastating. These swarms could contain billions of insects and could strip entire regions of vegetation in days. The lack of early warning systems meant that communities had no time to prepare for or protect against locust attacks. The psychological impact of locust swarms was severe. The sight of massive clouds of insects consuming everything green created terror and despair in affected communities. The knowledge that months or years of agricultural work could be destroyed in days created trauma that affected entire populations. Other insect infestations, while less dramatic than locust swarms, could be equally devastating. Caterpillar infestations could destroy tree crops and forests, while aphid infestations could destroy grain crops. The lack of pesticides or effective control methods meant that communities were completely vulnerable to these biological disasters. The timing of insect infestations was crucial. An infestation during the growing season could destroy crops before they could be harvested, while an infestation during storage could destroy food supplies that had already been harvested. The lack of effective storage techniques made communities particularly vulnerable to insect damage during the winter months. The Little Ice Age brought particularly severe challenges. Temperatures dropped significantly, growing seasons shortened, and formerly productive agricultural land became unusable. Communities that had existed for generations found themselves unable to grow enough food to survive. The cold also increased fuel needs for heating, but forests were often depleted by overuse. The cooling during the Little Ice Age was not uniform, but occurred in waves, with particularly severe periods in the 14th. The late medieval period 1300–1500 was particularly challenging, as communities that had expanded during the medieval warm period found themselves unable to sustain their populations during the cooler conditions. The shortened growing seasons meant that crops that had been reliable for generations suddenly began failing regularly. Wheat cultivation became impossible in many areas where it had been grown successfully for centuries. Communities were forced to switch to hardier crops like rye and barley, but these produced lower yields and provided less nutrition. The increased frequency of crop failures during the Little Ice Age created chronic food insecurity. Communities that had experienced occasional famines during the medieval warm period found themselves facing food shortages every few years. The constant threat of starvation created chronic stress that affected entire populations. Glacial advances during the Little Ice Age destroyed some communities entirely. Villages that had existed in marginal areas found themselves overwhelmed by advancing ice and snow. The increased snowfall made transportation difficult or impossible, isolating communities and preventing trade. The advance of glaciers in mountainous regions destroyed agricultural land and forced communities to relocate. The Mer de Glace, a glacier in the French Alps, advanced significantly during the Little Ice Age, destroying farms and villages that had existed for centuries. Similar glacial advances occurred throughout the mountainous regions of Europe, forcing populations to move to lower elevations. The increased snowfall during the Little Ice Age created additional challenges. Snow could remain on the ground for months longer than usual, preventing early planting and reducing growing seasons. The weight of snow could collapse buildings, while the difficulty of traveling through deep snow could isolate communities for months at a time. The psychological impact of glacial advance was severe. Communities that had existed in the same locations for generations found themselves forced to abandon their homes and traditional ways of life. The sight of advancing ice destroying familiar landscapes created trauma that affected entire populations. Sea level changes affected coastal communities. During the medieval warm period, sea levels were higher, flooding low-lying areas. During the Little Ice Age, sea levels dropped but storms became more severe. Coastal villages faced constant threats from storm surges and flooding. The North Sea storms of the 13th and 14th centuries were particularly devastating to coastal communities. The Great Storm of 1287 destroyed the port city of Winchelsea and created the Zuider Zee in the Netherlands. These storms killed thousands of people and permanently altered the geography of coastal regions. Coastal erosion was a constant threat to medieval communities. The primitive construction techniques used in coastal defenses offered little protection against the power of storms and high tides. Entire villages could be washed away by a single severe storm, with no warning systems to allow evacuation. The salt water intrusion that occurred during coastal flooding could contaminate freshwater supplies and agricultural land for years. The lack of understanding about soil salinity meant that communities often abandoned productive land unnecessarily, while others continued to use contaminated land that produced poor crops. The changing coastlines during the medieval period created additional challenge. Areas that had been inland during the Roman period found themselves threatened by the sea, while former coastal areas became landlocked. Communities that had developed economies based on fishing or maritime trade found themselves cut off from the sea by changing geography. The lack of scientific understanding made environmental disasters even more traumatic. Medieval people had no understanding of climate patterns, weather systems, or natural cycles. They interpreted environmental disasters as divine punishment or supernatural events, which added psychological terror to physical suffering. The religious interpretation of environmental disasters created additional psychological trauma. When crops failed or storms struck, communities often blamed themselves for angering God through their sins. This self-blame added spiritual anguish to the physical suffering caused by environmental disaster. The lack of weather forecasting meant that all environmental disasters struck without warning. Communities had no ability to prepare for storms, droughts, or flood. They relied on traditional indicators like animal behavior or folk wisdom, but these methods were unreliable and often led to false confidence or unnecessary panic. The absence of scientific understanding meant that communities could not learn from environmental disasters or develop effective responses. They had no knowledge of climate cycles, weather patterns, or natural phenomena that could help them predict or prepare for future disasters. The superstitious interpretation of environmental events often led to harmful responses. Communities might engage in religious rituals or persecution of scapegoats, rather than taking practical steps to protect themselves. The lack of rational understanding made environmental disasters even more devastating. Recovery from environmental disasters was extremely slow. Without modern technology, insurance systems, or government assistance, communities that suffered environmental catastrophes had to rebuild entirely through their own efforts. Many communities never recovered from major disasters and were simply abandoned. The lack of building codes or construction standards meant that communities often rebuilt in the same vulnerable locations, using the same inadequate technique. They had no knowledge of how to construct buildings that could withstand floods, storms, or earthquakes, so they remained vulnerable to repeated disasters. The absence of insurance or financial assistance meant that communities had to rebuild using only their own resources. The loss of tools, livestock, and stored food during disasters often meant that communities lacked the resources necessary for recovery. Many communities became trapped in cycles of destruction and inadequate rebuild. The lack of transportation and communication systems made it difficult for communities to receive assistance from unaffected areas. Even when help was available, it often could not reach disaster-affected areas due to poor roads and limited transportation technology. The psychological impact of living under constant environmental threat was profound. People lived in constant fear of the next disaster, never knowing when drought, flood, storm, or other catastrophe might destroy their lives. This chronic anxiety affected entire communities and contributed to the overall despair of medieval life. The unpredictability of environmental disasters created chronic stress that affected mental and physical health. People lived in constant fear of losing everything they had worked for, never knowing when the next disaster might strike. This chronic anxiety contributed to the shortened lifespans and poor health that characterized medieval life. The knowledge that environmental disasters could destroy years of work in days created a sense of futility that affected motivation and planning. People were reluctant to invest effort in long-term improvements when they knew that a single disaster could destroy everything. This attitude contributed to the technological stagnation that characterized medieval society. The repeated experience of environmental disasters created learned helplessness in medieval communities. People came to believe that they had no control over their environment and that disasters were inevitable. This psychological state made it difficult for communities to develop effective responses to environmental challenges. The social disruption caused by environmental disasters had long-lasting effects on community cohesion. The stress of survival during disasters often led to increased conflict and social breakdown. Communities that had been stable during normal times could disintegrate rapidly when faced with environmental crises. The combination of feudal oppression, environmental vulnerability, primitive technology, and brutal social control created a system that maximized human suffering while minimizing human potential. The feudal system was perhaps the most oppressive form of social organization ever devised. It created legal frameworks that trapped people in generational cycles of poverty and dependence. Unlike slavery, which at least recognized that people were valuable property worth maintaining, feudalism treated peasants as disposable labor sources who could be worked to death without significant economic loss. The systematic nature of feudal oppression was particularly devastating. Unlike other forms of oppression that might affect some aspects of life while leaving others relatively free, feudalism controlled every aspect of human existence. Economic relationships, social interactions, religious practices, family structures, and personal decisions were all subject to feudal control. The legal codification of feudal relationships made escape virtually impossible. The feudal system was not just a collection of informal customs, but a comprehensive legal framework that defined the rights and obligations of each social class. These laws were enforced through a combination of religious authority, military power, and social pressure that made resistance extremely difficult. The intergenerational nature of feudal oppression created a system of permanent inequality. Unlike other forms of oppression that might affect individuals during their lifetimes, feudalism trapped families in cycles of poverty and dependence that continued for generations. Children inherited their parents' social status and economic obligations, making social mobility virtually impossible. The ideological justification for feudalism made it particularly. The system was presented as natural, necessary, and divinely ordained, making resistance seem not just futile but morally wrong. This ideological framework prevented people from imagining alternatives to their oppression and made them complicit in their own subjugation. The agricultural technology of medieval villages was so primitive that it guaranteed periodic starvation. The three-field system, wooden plows, and hand tools were inadequate for supporting stable population. Communities were always one bad harvest away from famine, and multiple bad harvests meant death for large portions of the population. The inefficiency of medieval agricultural technology meant that enormous amounts of human labor were required to produce minimal amounts of food. The majority of the population had to be engaged in food production, leaving little human capital available for other activities. This technological limitation prevented the development of specialized crafts, trade, or intellectual pursuit. The lack of agricultural innovation during the medieval period is particularly striking. While other civilizations developed irrigation systems, improved crop varieties, and more efficient farming techniques, medieval European agriculture remained largely unchanged for centuries. This technological stagnation condemned generation after generation to the same inefficient and unreliable methods of food production. The vulnerability of medieval agriculture to environmental disasters made food insecurity a constant threat. The lack of drought-resistant crops, irrigation systems, or food storage techniques meant that communities were completely dependent on favorable weather conditions. This vulnerability created chronic anxiety and made long-term planning impossible. The primitive nature of medieval agricultural technology also limited population growth and economic development. The low productivity of medieval farming meant that communities could not support large populations or accumulate the surpluses necessary for economic growth. This kept medieval society trapped in a cycle of poverty and technological stagnation. The medical knowledge of medieval times was not just inadequate, but actively harmful. The combination of bloodletting, purging, and other dangerous treatments probably killed more people than they helped. The lack of understanding about sanitation, contagion, and basic hygiene created environments where disease flourished. The theoretical framework of medieval medicine was based on ancient Greek and Roman texts that were centuries out of date and often based on incorrect assumptions. The theory of the four humours, which dominated medieval medical thinking, led to treatments that were often harmful and sometimes fatal. The reliance on these incorrect theories prevented the development of effective medical treatment. The practice of medieval medicine was often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting, which was used to treat a wide variety of conditions, weakened patients and made them more vulnerable to infection and death. Purging and other treatments designed to balance the humours often caused dehydration, malnutrition, and other serious health problems. The lack of understanding about contagion and disease transmission meant that medieval medical practices often spread disease rather than preventing it. The reuse of medical instruments without sterilization, the lack of quarantine procedures, and the poor sanitation in hospitals and treatment centers created conditions where diseases could spread rapidly. The integration of religious and medical practices often prevented effective treatment. The belief that disease was caused by sin or supernatural forces led to treatments that focused on spiritual rather than physical healing. This religious interpretation of disease often delayed or prevented the use of effective medical treatment. The social control mechanisms of medieval villages were designed to prevent people from improving their conditions. Education was restricted, travel was forbidden, and independent thinking was punished. The system was specifically designed to maintain inequality and prevent social mobility. The comprehensive nature of social control in medieval villages was particularly oppressive. Unlike modern societies where some spheres of life might be relatively free from government control, medieval villages controlled every aspect of human existence. Religious authorities, feudal lords, and social customs combined to create a system of total social control. The use of religious authority to justify social control was particularly effective. The Church taught that the existing social order was divinely ordained and that challenging it was sinful. This religious justification made resistance seem not just futile, but morally wrong, preventing people from working to improve their condition. The punishment of independent thinking was systematic and severe. People who questioned established authority, proposed new ideas, or challenged existing practices faced social ostracism, physical punishment, or this created a climate of fear that prevented intellectual development and social progress. The restriction of education to a small elite was a key mechanism of social control. By keeping the majority of the population illiterate and ignorant, the ruling classes could maintain their power and prevent challenges to their authority. The lack of education also prevented people from developing the skills necessary for social and economic advancement. The environmental challenges of medieval life were made worse by the lack of effective technology. Without weather forecasting, flood control, or disaster preparedness, communities were completely vulnerable to natural disasters. Climate change during the medieval period created additional challenges that primitive societies couldn't address. The lack of understanding about environmental processes made medieval communities particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. They had no knowledge of climate patterns, weather systems, or natural cycles that could help them predict or prepare for environmental challenges. This ignorance made environmental disasters even more devastating. The primitive technology available to medieval communities was inadequate for addressing environmental challenges. They had no ability to control floods, predict storms, or protect crops from environmental damage. This technological limitation made communities completely dependent on favorable environmental conditions. The lack of environmental management techniques meant that medieval communities often made environmental problems worse through their own action. Deforestation, soil depletion, and overgrazing were common problems that reduced agricultural productivity and made communities more vulnerable to environmental disasters. The absence of disaster preparedness and response systems meant that communities had no effective way to deal with environmental crises. They had no early warning systems, no emergency supplies, and no organized response procedures. This lack of preparedness made environmental disasters even more devastating. The psychological impact of medieval life was perhaps the most devastating aspect. The combination of chronic stress, constant fear, and complete hopelessness created mental health problems that affected entire populations. People lived in a state of permanent trauma that would be considered pathological by modern standards. The chronic stress of medieval life was created by the constant threat of starvation, disease, violence, and environmental disaster. People lived in a state of permanent anxiety, never knowing when the next crisis might destroy their life. This chronic stress had severe effects on both mental and physical health. The lack of hope for the future was particularly damaging to mental health. Medieval people knew that their lives would never improve, that their children would face the same hardships, and that there was no possibility of escape from their conditions. This hopelessness created depression and despair that affected entire communities. The social isolation of medieval life contributed to poor mental health. The lack of privacy, the constant surveillance by authorities, and the restriction of personal expression prevented people from developing healthy relationships and personal identity. This social isolation created additional psychological stress. The trauma of witnessing constant death, violence, and suffering had profound effects on mental health. Medieval people regularly witnessed the death of children, the suffering of family members, and the destruction of their communities. This repeated trauma created psychological damage that affected entire populations. The treatment of children in medieval villages was particularly horrific. Child mortality rates around 50% meant that parents expected to lose half their children. Those who survived faced immediate entry into adult labor, physical abuse, and complete lack of education or opportunity. Childhood as a protected period of development simply didn't exist. The high infant mortality rate meant that parents had to maintain emotional distance from their children to protect themselves from constant grief. This emotional detachment had severe effects on child development and created patterns of dysfunctional parenting that were passed down through generations. The immediate entry of children into adult labor prevented normal physical and psychological development. Children were expected to perform dangerous and exhausting work from an early age, which stunted their growth and development. The lack of time for play, learning, and social development created adults who were psychologically damaged and unprepared for healthy relationships. The physical abuse of children was common and accepted as normal. Children were beaten regularly by parents, employers, and authorities, creating trauma that affected their entire lives. The lack of protection for children from violence and abuse created a culture where violence was normalized and accepted. The complete lack of educational opportunities for children meant that they had no chance to develop their intellectual potential. The vast majority of children remained illiterate and ignorant throughout their lives, never having the opportunity to learn about the world beyond their immediate experience. The position of women in medieval society was especially oppressive. Women had no legal rights, no economic autonomy, and no protection from violence. They were treated as property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. The dangers of childbirth made their lives even more precarious. The legal status of women was essentially that of property. They could not own land, make contracts, or participate in legal proceedings. They were transferred from the control of their fathers to the control of their husbands through marriage, with no opportunity for independent legal existence. The economic dependence of women made them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. They could not support themselves independently and were completely dependent on male relatives for survival. This economic dependence made it impossible for women to escape abusive relationships or improve their conditions. The constant threat of death in childbirth made women's lives particularly precarious. With maternal mortality rates around 10 to 20%, women faced a significant risk of death each time they became pregnant. The lack of effective medical care and the frequent pregnancies that were expected of women made their lives extremely dangerous. The domestic violence that was common in medieval society was particularly devastating for women, who had no legal recourse against abuse. Husbands could beat their wives with impunity, and women had no legal or social protection against domestic violence. This created a culture where violence against women was normalized and accepted. The religious system of medieval villages was used as a tool of oppression rather than comfort. The church taught people to accept their suffering as divinely ordained and to expect reward only in the afterlife. This religious framework prevented people from working to improve their earthly conditions. The teaching that earthly suffering was divinely ordained was particularly damaging because it discouraged people from working to improve their condition. The church taught that poverty and suffering were spiritually beneficial and that attempting to change one's circumstances was sinful. This religious framework prevented social progress and reform. The promise of reward in the afterlife was used to justify earthly oppression. People were taught that their suffering would be rewarded in heaven, but only if they accepted their earthly conditions without complaint. This religious framework made people complicit in their own oppression. The use of religious authority to justify political and economic oppression was particularly effective. The church taught that the existing social order was divinely ordained and that challenging it was sinful. This religious justification made resistance seem not just futile, but morally. The integration of religious and secular authority created a system of total control. The church was not just a spiritual institution, but also a political and economic power that controlled vast amounts of land and wealth. This integration made it impossible to challenge religious authority without also challenging political and economic power. The economic system of medieval villages was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal compensation. The feudal obligations, taxes, and fees created a system where people worked constantly but never accumulated wealth or security. Economic mobility was not just difficult, but legally impossible. The comprehensive nature of economic exploitation in medieval villages was particularly oppressive. Peasants owed labor service to their lords, rent for their land, taxes to the church, and fees for using essential services. These obligations often consumed 70–80% of a peasant's productive output, leaving barely enough for survival. The legal prohibition on peasant land ownership meant that they could never build equity or accumulate wealth. They were permanently trapped in relationships of economic dependence, unable to improve their conditions through hard work or innovation. This legal framework guaranteed that economic inequality would continue across generations. The restriction of trade and commerce prevented peasants from developing alternative sources of income. They were prohibited from engaging in most forms of commerce and were restricted to their assigned roles in the feudal system. This prevented economic innovation and kept peasants trapped in subsistence agriculture. The extraction of surplus production by feudal lords prevented capital accumulation and economic development. Any surplus that peasants produced was immediately taken by their superiors, preventing the accumulation of wealth that could be used for investment or improvement. This kept the entire economic system trapped in a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment. The legal system offered no protection for ordinary people. Justice was arbitrary, punishment was brutal, and there was no concept of individual rights. People lived under the constant threat of violence from both criminals and legal authority. The manorial court system was designed to maintain feudal relationships rather than provide justice. These courts were controlled by the same lords who exploited peasants, making fair treatment impossible. Peasants had no access to higher courts, no right to legal representation, and no protection against arbitrary punishment. The use of torture and brutal punishment was common and accepted as normal. People accused of crimes faced torture, mutilation, or death without due process. The methods used to determine guilt were based on superstition rather than evidence, making the legal system arbitrary and unreliable. The lack of individual rights meant that people had no protection against abuse by those in authority. Lords could seize peasant property, assault peasants physically, or impose arbitrary punishments without facing any legal consequences. This created a climate of fear that affected all aspects of life. The technological limitations of medieval life made every aspect of existence more difficult. Without basic tools, machines, or scientific knowledge, people had to perform back-breaking labor to accomplish tasks that modern technology makes simple. The lack of transportation, communication, and manufacturing technology kept communities isolated and vulnerable. The primitive nature of medieval technology meant that enormous amounts of human labor were required to accomplish basic tasks. The lack of mechanical devices, efficient tools, or power sources meant that everything had to be done by hand, making life exhausting and inefficient. The lack of transportation technology kept communities isolated and prevented the development of trade and commerce. The poor roads, primitive vehicles, and lack of navigational aids made travel dangerous and expensive. This isolation prevented the exchange of ideas and resources that could have improved conditions. The absence of communication technology meant that communities were cut off from information about the outside world. They had no access to news, new ideas, or knowledge that could help them improve their conditions. This isolation contributed to the technological and social stagnation of medieval life. The lack of manufacturing technology meant that communities had to produce everything they needed using primitive tools and techniques. This made goods expensive and of poor quality, while also requiring enormous amounts of labor to produce basic necessities. The demographic patterns of medieval villages reveal the true horror of these conditions. Life expectancy was around 30 years, infant mortality was extraordinary, and population growth was frequently reversed by famine and disease. These statistics represent millions of individual tragedies and shortened lives. The low life expectancy of medieval people was the result of multiple factors: poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, dangerous working conditions, and frequent epidemic. The fact that most people died before reaching middle age represents an enormous waste of human potential and experience. The high infant mortality rate meant that families experienced constant grief and trauma. The loss of children was so common that it became normalized, but this did not reduce the psychological impact on parents and families. The constant threat of child death created chronic anxiety that affected entire communities. The frequent reversals of population growth due to famine and disease created demographic instability that prevented long-term planning and development. Communities that had grown during favorable periods would be decimated by crises making it impossible to build stable institutions or accumulate resources. The demographic patterns of medieval villages also reveal the failure of the social and economic systems to provide basic security for their populations. The fact that populations could not maintain stable growth demonstrates the inadequacy of medieval technology and social organization. The cultural legacy of medieval villages was largely negative. The period produced little art, literature, or intellectual achievement compared to other historical periods. The oppressive conditions prevented the development of human potential and creativity. Most people lived and died without ever having the opportunity to develop their talents or contribute to human knowledge. The lack of educational opportunities meant that most people remained illiterate and ignorant throughout their life. This prevented the development of intellectual culture and kept knowledge restricted to a small elite. The vast majority of human intellectual potential was simply wasted. The restriction of artistic expression to religious themes, approved by authorities, prevented the development of creative culture. The few artistic works that were produced were heavily censored and controlled, preventing the development of independent artistic tradition. The lack of leisure time and resources meant that most people had no opportunity to engage in creative activities. The constant demands of survival left no time for artistic pursuits, intellectual development, or cultural activity. This created a society where culture was impoverished and human creativity was suppressed. The isolation of medieval communities prevented the exchange of ideas and cultural influences that could have stimulated intellectual and artistic development. The lack of contact with other cultures and ideas kept medieval society trapped in intellectual stagnation. The comparison with other historical periods makes the medieval village experience even more tragic. Earlier civilizations like Rome and Greece had achieved higher levels of technology, social organization, and individual freedom. Later periods would develop systems that provided greater security and opportunity. The medieval period represents a regression in human development. The Roman Empire, despite its flaws, had achieved higher levels of technology, infrastructure, and social organization than medieval Europe. The decline from Roman standards to medieval conditions represents a massive regression in human development. The loss of Roman knowledge and technology condemned medieval people to centuries of unnecessary suffering. The achievements of ancient Greece in philosophy, science, and the arts were largely unknown to medieval people. The intellectual traditions that had flourished in ancient Greece were suppressed or forgotten, preventing the development of rational thought and scientific inquiry. This intellectual regression had profound effects on human development. The later Renaissance and Enlightenment periods would rediscover and build upon the achievements of ancient civilizations, leading to rapid progress in science, technology, and human rights. The fact that this progress was possible demonstrates that the suffering of the medieval period was not inevitable, but was the result of specific social and economic arrangements. The comparison with other medieval civilizations also reveals the particular brutality of European feudalism. Islamic, Chinese, and other civilizations during the same period had achieved higher levels of technology, social organization, and individual freedom. The European medieval system was particularly oppressive, even by the standards of its time. In conclusion, medieval villages represented a uniquely oppressive combination of technological primitivism, social control, economic exploitation, and environmental vulnerability. The system was specifically designed to maximize the extraction of labor while minimizing the welfare of the producers. The result was a society that wasted human potential on a massive scale and created unnecessary suffering for millions of people. The legacy of medieval villages serves as a reminder of how social and economic systems can be organized to serve the interests of a few at the expense of the many, and why the development of human rights, democratic institutions, and technological progress should never be taken for granted. As we reach the end of our journey through the harsh realities of medieval village life, perhaps you can understand why sleep was one of the few mercies available to these suffering communities. In sleep, the hungry could dream of full bellies, The oppressed could imagine freedom, and the hopeless could escape, if only temporarily, from their brutal reality. The medieval villagers we've learned about tonight lived lives that were characterized by constant struggle, endless suffering, and very little hope. From the moment they were born until the day they died, usually by age 30, they faced challenges that would be unimaginable to modern people. They lived with hunger, disease, violence, and oppression as constant companions. Their days began before dawn with back-breaking labor and ended after dark with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same. They watched their children die from preventable diseases, saw their communities destroyed by famine and warfare, and lived under social systems designed to keep them in permanent servitude. Yet somehow, these people persevered. They found ways to maintain communities, to care for their families, and to create meaning in lives that seemed meaningless. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story. The medieval village experience teaches us valuable lessons about human nature and social organization. It shows us what happens when technological limitations combine with oppressive social systems. It reveals the importance of education, healthcare, and individual rights. Most importantly, it helps us appreciate the progress that humanity has made in creating more just and humane societies. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in your comfortable bed, with a full stomach and the security of knowing that tomorrow will likely bring new opportunities rather than new threats. Remember the millions of people who lived and died in medieval villages. Their suffering was real, their struggles were immense, and their lives were far shorter and more difficult than anything we can imagine. But their story is also our story. We are all connected to those medieval villagers through the long chain of human history. Their struggles and sacrifices, their small victories and overwhelming defeats, all contributed to the world we live in today. The freedoms we enjoy, the opportunities we have, and the security we feel were built on the foundation of their experience. In learning about their lives, we honor their memory and gain perspective on our own existence. We understand that the problems we face today, while real and important, are part of a human story that has seen much greater challenges and survived them. So as you fall asleep tonight, let the gentle rhythm of your breathing and the comfort of your surroundings remind you that you are living in one of the most fortunate periods in human history. The medieval villagers would have considered your life a paradise beyond their wildest dream. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring new possibilities, new chances for happiness and fulfillment, and new opportunities to appreciate the remarkable progress that humanity has made since those dark days when survival was the only goal and suffering was the only certainty. The medieval village may have been one of the worst places to live in human history, but it was also a crucial chapter in the story of human resilience and the long journey toward a more just and humane world. Sweet